Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto was sent to Lord of the Rings. Before I start, please support for more amazing content, and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by odmonkey and link in description and support writer. Let's start the video. And you are certain Nathrander? Elrond didn't move his gaze from the rolling fields outside Rivendell, but his companion knew the weight of the words. I understand your misgivings, old friend, but in these dark times it would be folly to scorn any reinforcements. Even ones as unconventional as these. I still fail to understand how their world intersects with ours. In truth, I do not understand either, but the fact remains they. Elrond turned suddenly, surprising Gandalf with the dark expression on his fair features. Was it not Saruman, the traitor, who enlightened you as to the passageway? We are to trust his counsel. Gandalf sighed, resisting the urge to pull out his pipe to steel his nerves. Elrond was correct to worry. He has not made use of the passage for many years, perhaps more than fourscore. I have traveled to their world and they are willing to aid us. For what reason? What is their price? The Lord had returned to casting his steely glaze out over his lands. Their demands were not extortionate. For 3 warriors they were willing to accept a measure of mithril and several texts relating to the vanquishing of demonic forces. We have known each other for many lives of men, Nathrander. You have my trust, but I cannot see the difference 3 warriors will make, no matter their skills. Elrond's face was a smooth mask, concealing the troubled expression that filled his eyes. We were extremely fortunate to be given even that number. Their world is not without strife of its own, and they were hard-pressed to spare us them. They refused to show the extent of their skills, but from what I was permitted to see we would be foolish to turn them away. I disagree with this course of action, Nathrander. Our world suffers enough without the addition of men completely foreign to the dangers that stalk these lands. Gandalf leaned heavily on his staff. He was feeling the many years this body had endured. He had hoped for more support from the Elf Lord, especially with his gift of foresight. However, Elrond had said that his visions were less clear than they once were, and he could not be sure whether this venture would go good or ill. Gandalf attributed this to the encroaching darkness. Many of those with the gift had reported their difficulties. The only exception appeared to be Faramir. Boromir had stated that the prophetic dream that brought him hither had come to his brother many times. Despite these worrying portents, Gandalf was convinced that he was correct in contacting the strange world. Their aid could not go amiss, not when defenses were stretched to breaking point already. Mirkwood was under constant attack. Saruman would turn his attentions to Rohan in the coming months, and Gondor was an increasingly fragile bulwark against the tide. He just hoped Elrond would put aside his misgivings enough to see that the culture their new allies came from was incredibly different, so much so that he wasn't sure how well they would cope. Finally, reaching into his pocket to get his pipe, he surveyed the area from which they would be arriving any day. He couldn't identify the feeling in his bones. It could be either good or bad. Praying for good, he lit his pipe weed, ignoring the way Elrond distanced himself with a scowl. XXXXX. Although Gandalf had hoped he would be the first to meet the strangers when they arrived, that privilege went to Elladan and Elrohir. Their duties had only just returned them to their father's lands, and they hadn't yet shaken off their traveling habits, so were awake the night the 3 figures suddenly appeared at the edge of Rivendell. While the twins had been told by their father to expect their presence at some point, it was still a shock to them. Elves were so attuned to their surroundings it was jarring to find their senses had failed to alert them to the presence of their father's visitors until they were upon them. Out of the dark 3 figures materialized, clad almost completely in black. Under the cowls of their thick traveling cloaks, bone-white masks shone in the weak moonlight. Elladan hadn't realized he had reached for the handle of his blade until he felt his brother's hand gently loosen his grip. The figures hadn't moved, but the twins detected a hint of amusement in the air around them, and immediately felt a little sheepish. Unsure how to proceed, they were relieved when the 3 bowed, and one spoke, a young man's voice muffled by the mask. We wish to speak to Gandalf. His accent was atrocious, and his pronunciation of Gandalf almost brought a smile to the lips of the elves. However, the voice was firm, and the twins were able to remember their decorum. Despite the fact these strangers were expected by their father and Nathrander, years of experience dealing with the forces of darkness made them loath to invite them within their father's halls. Their hesitation was evidently noticed as the air around the strangers became noticeably chill, and the speaker folded his arms and settled into a sturdier stance. Thankfully, the rather tense moment of indecision was broken by the arrival of the wizard in question, followed by Elrond. Gandalf lacked the discomfort displayed by the elf lord, but it was clear to the twins' sharp eyes that he was wary of those he had enlisted. Gandalf bowed to the strangers and, after sharing a meaningful look with Elrond, began leading them into the halls of Rivendell. XXXXX. Boromir attempted to hide a yawn behind one of his large fists, as his elf guide led him to the latest meeting. It was difficult for the man not to begrudge the elves their composure, in times of trouble and at all times of the night. Since the council a few days previously, the Fellowship had been awaiting news of their new allies, a topic Gandalf had broached to them privately once the meeting had passed. Infuriatingly, the wizard had been as cryptic as his father in one of his worst moods, and Boromir could not be entirely sure what these strangers were capable of. As he had been woken in the middle of the night, he could only assume that the wizard desired the Fellowship to meet them as soon as possible. In the hallway they soon approached Gimli and his elven guide. Their pace was slow, ostensibly because of Gimli's shorter legs, but Boromir knew it was one of the many tricks the dwarf used to irritate his hosts. While their guides shared an inscrutable look, Gimli gave him a smirk that confirmed his suspicions. Smothering a smile of his own, he clapped the dwarf on the shoulder and continued towards their destination. At the doorway to the private meeting hall the elves departed, leaving the two to walk in by themselves. The ranger was already present, as was their host and their elven companion Legolas. Boromir remembered enough of his deportment lessons to bow in greeting, while Gimli simply made his way over to the fire with a grunt of acknowledgement. He gritted his teeth a little at the superior look that was shared between elf and elfkin, and thought for the 100th time that Faramir should have come in his stead. Little brother was much more suited to the learned discourse, flighty music and lack of ale present in this place. Boromir's idle fantasy of being back defending Osgiliath with a well-deserved flagon waiting for him was disrupted by the entrance of the hobbits. How strange that ones who looked so like children should be older than he. The younger two, Merry and Pippin, perked up on seeing the one person within Rivendell willing to share in their chatter. They gathered around his legs, seemingly too tired to manage much beyond the occasional yawn. Frodo and his shadow Sam took to the other man, who they seemed to feel more at ease with. They weren't waiting long before Gandalf arrived with 3 cloaked and masked figures in tow. They were relatively short, one standing barely over 5 foot, but Boromir had been a soldier too long to let something like that cloud his judgment. After all, had not dwarves shown their courage, resilience and skill for uncountable years despite their height? Out of the corner of his eye he saw Elrond was hard-pressed to keep a scowl from affecting his features. If it was obvious to him, then it must have been clear as day to Gandalf. The wizard ignored the tense atmosphere and merely smiled, clearing his throat to speak. Fellowship, and our esteemed host, these are the reinforcements, our allies in Kanahagakur. He stumbled over the unfamiliar word, similar to Dwarvish in its hard consonants. They are most skilled warriors. What appeared to be the leader of the 3 shifted into an open and carefree stance, with his hand outstretched in a strange manner, with the thumb pointing directly up and the fist curled. Boromir, and he could see Gimli too, felt more at ease. This action was more suited to a soldier than the stiff control of their new elvish brethren. Elrond, Aragorn and Legolas shared a disapproving look. At least Boromir assumed it was so, despite their faces betraying nothing of their emotions. This did not pass by one of their new friends, the shortest one, whose mask was tilted to give them a clear view of this exchange. However, they said nothing, allowing Gandalf to continue his introduction. I do not know as yet their real names. To avoid any suspicion from the enemy, they have been using only their aliases. Please, friends, this is a safe haven, show yourselves. Gandalf bowed and stepped towards the fire, as anxious as his fellows to see what lurked under their cowls. The 3 shared a look, the shortest one seeming to sigh, before reaching to remove their masks. Their leader pulled away the fox-shaped enamel to reveal a young, tan man, of no more than 25. His hair was an arrestingly bright shade of blonde and spiked and waved in a manner that had never been seen in Middle-earth before. Clearly enjoying the shock, his vibrant blue eyes shone, and a mischievous smile showed his pointed incisors under strange markings on his cheeks. I am Uzumaki Naruto. Call me just Naruto. His voice was gregarious despite his stilted speech. Taking advantage of the rapid and awkward silence, Naruto's companion stepped into the breach. The 2 men were as night and day. Where Naruto was blonde, his friend was as black as ink. Dark eyes stood as coal in the snow of his pale features. A rather strained and unnatural smile covered his face as he bowed in greeting. I am Sai. Boromir could feel Merry and Pippin clinging to his legs, but he didn't feel threatened by these men. Their leader especially had a sense of levity that he found refreshing after so long in this place. Their last member seemed more reluctant, but slid the cowl down to show pale pink hair. As they tugged their mask off, Boromir and his companions fought to bring his eyebrows down from where they had shot into his own hair. The pink hair was soon explained by the presence of a young woman, a similar age to her companions, with piercing green eyes. The silence that had been more interested turned to shock. Boromir could see Elrond becoming indignant at being sent a woman as aide. You may call me Sakura. Her command of the language was stronger than her companions, less unsure on the stresses and more flowing. Unlike the others, Gandalf did not look taken aback and merely smiled in a grandfatherly way at the girl. With all due respect, Mithrandir, a woman. Gandalf raised a hand to cut Aragorn off. The air had become freezing, and the burning look being cast the ranger's way by said woman was enough for Gimli and Boromir to be glad they had not raised the issue. Aragorn, do not underestimate this young woman. In the culture of our friends here, men and women are both trained to fight from when they are children. Sakura here is the apprentice of the leader of their village. The position of leader is only given to the strongest, the most capable, and Tsunadeheim is that, and also a woman. Naruto and Sai had moved, silently so that the gathered fellowship had not noticed, to take up flanking positions behind her, scowling in silent support. If they do not want me, I shall go. I have much else to do. Her voice was firm, though laced with anger. While Gandalf raised his arms in an open manner, the elves saw the fear in his eyes, fear that these people would leave. Come now, my friends are just unused to such a culture. They realize the value of your aid. They'd better, or else. The blonde spoke, but the language was foreign to them, even to Elrond, who had studied most over his long years. Sakura folded her arms. Tsunade had warned Gandalf that a place where women were relegated to home and hearth would struggle with her occasionally unfeminine apprentice. Part of her contract stated that if she was made to feel unwelcome, then she would be allowed to leave. It was completely out of the ordinary for a shinobi contract, but ANBU medics were in such short supply it was a wonder she had been sent at all. Boromir and Gimli shared a look over the heads of the hobbits. A slight nod confirmed that they would wait to make a judgment until they had seen the visitors in action. It was clear to the man that from the way Pippin was shifting, he was going to ask a question. He just prayed it was a sensible one. "How did you get your hair such a color, Mom?" Pippin queried, effectively dashing Boromir's hopes. The hobbit quailed slightly when those hard green eyes turned to him, but Pippin was very difficult to remain angry with. "It is natural. It has always been so." Pippin seemed ready to pipe up with another, no doubt equally asinine, question, so Boromir laid a hand on his hair and spoke for the first time. "Reinforcements are sorely needed." He smiled lopsidedly at the three. "Were that there were more." Naruto grinned, a sunny smile the likes of which had been hard to find in these dark times. "We the best." "We are the best," Sai murmured under his breath, earning himself a reproachful glare from his teammate. "We have only had small amount of time to learn this language." Aragorn shared a long look with his father while Merry began asking the guests how to say things in their own language, while Boromir and Gimli attempted to stop him, inconveniencing them. Elrond sighed, bringing a hand up to pinch the bridge of his nose before approaching his new allies. "No doubt you are weary after such a long journey. Please, rest until the morning. Then we should all like to see how you will be able to aid us." He held out an arm, signaling the finality of this conversation. The three snapped to attention and bowed deeply, oddly in sync in a way that reminded Boromir of the drill exercises his father had been so fond of. Merry and Pippin made an effort to imitate them, bringing a slight smile to their faces. The others merely nodded, for the most part still unsure as to this unusual situation. As if summoned by the thought of their lord alone, servants appeared at the doors ready to escort all present back to their chambers. The elves did their utmost to smother their surprise on seeing the guests unmasked and merely asked them to follow. Naruto left first, throwing another unfamiliar hand gesture similar to a salute but with 2 fingers. Sakura followed him, the lines of her shoulders showing her lingering unease. Sai took up the rear, letting his pitch-black eyes scan over the assembled fellowship a last time before departing. When they had left, all eyes turned to Gandalf, who was happily puffing away on his long pipe. He raised his eyebrows, smiling through the rising smoke. "Tomorrow should prove interesting, just as they have." "Interesting is certainly one word for it," Gimli snorted, sharing an amused look with the Gondorian. "Let us hope they are as skilled as you think, Mithrandir." Elrond spoke with a steel undertone to his words, making all in the room feel on edge with the shift in atmosphere. Gandalf's eyes did not dim as he blew out a plume of smoke. Indeed, XXXXX. Breakfast in the morning was less strained than the previous evening. The hobbits were more awake and indulging in their favorite pastime. It made for a jolly atmosphere that the more hardened of their company absorbed with relish. The guests also seemed more at ease and hid their resentment at being watched, with an extreme lack of subtlety on the part of their host, with grace. Sam was very interested in their method of eating. They appeared unfamiliar with cutlery, examining the utensils and speaking softly to one another in their own language. This had progressed to watching others eating with a keen eye and imitating their movements. Watching them struggle was driving Sam to distraction, but given the rather tense atmosphere he was wary of drawing any unwanted attention to himself. Eventually the hobbit could no longer contain himself on seeing the blonde picking up some fruit and examining it before casting a confused look at his spoon. "Begging your pardon, sir, but if you cut that in 2 you can get at the inside easily enough," he stuttered, attempting to avoid eye contact with the man's more intimidating friends. Naturally there had been a distinct lull in conversation at the crucial moment, and silence had descended as those present observed the reaction of the strange visitors. Sam shifted in his seat, mortified that he had become the center of attention. Sakura and Sai merely squared their shoulders and continued eating, striving to ignore the tension their very presence was causing. Naruto threw the fruit a little into the air and, with efficiency that had all present taken aback, swept up his knife and sliced it neatly in 2. "Thank you, Samwise?" His tone pulled up at the end of the sentence, as he stumbled slightly over the gardener's name. Sam nodded furiously, keeping his eyes firmly pinned to his plate. Aragorn and his father shared a look. The ease with which their guest had used his knife certainly gave them pause for thought. "What do you eat with then?" Merry said, taking pity on Sam and drawing away their attentions. Sai reached behind him and pulled out a long, thin package out of the pack slung over the back of his chair. Merry and Pippin crowded forward, incredibly excited to be being given something exotic. Pulling the paper away delicately, they were surprised to see 2 slim pieces of wood, completely smooth and tapered to one end. Those sitting around the 2 were also interested, although the elves were attempting to disguise the fact. Looking up at Sai, the confusion was easy to read across their faces, bringing a smile to the faces of the ninja. "I'm afraid I don't understand, sirs, Mom." Sam had taken the chopsticks out of Mary's hand and was turning them over, attempting to puzzle them out in his head, while Pippin questioned Sai. "Here." Sai's tone was clipped but not unkind as he held out a pale hand to the gardener. Sam flushed again as he handed them back to their owner. All pretense of ignoring this exchange had stopped, and there was relative silence as Sai snapped apart the 2 pieces of wood, an automatic Itadakimasa falling quietly from the lips of the 3 ninjas. Once they were separated, he held them between his slim fingers so that the ends formed a pinching point. Reaching forward, he picked up a piece of cut fruit between them, lifting it effortless to his lips. Merry and Pippin shared an excited glance, and practically snatched them from his hand to try the technique for themselves. You will have to show us the food you eat in such a manner, Boromir piped up to break the awkward silence that had descended, throwing the three an easy smile. Do not let Sakura. Naruto trailed off, as he tried to summon the common tongue for cook. Looking to his right, he flinched slightly at the piercing look Sakura was giving him. However, a muttered baka was the worst he received for the time being. His discomfort seemed to further alleviate the tension as the married men of the room ruefully recognized the strength of an irritated woman. It is not a skill we come by easily, said Sai, smoothly averting attention from the ire of his companion. Few can cook well. What skills do you possess then? Elrond's tone was cool, and those more warmly disposed towards the visitors shifted uncomfortably as the uncomfortable atmosphere returned. Naruto shook his head suddenly. Boromir suspected a swift kick had been delivered under the table to prevent him from acting on the annoyed look that passed over his face at his host's words. Again it fell to Sai to divert attention back to the truly important matters. Sakura would fare better, but she had elected to suppress her fiery personality so as not to alarm their hosts. Elrond was unsure of them, but, although Naruto and Sakura felt it strongly, he was not being impolite nor forgetting his manners. Gandalf considered him an ally, and as their employer his will was to be trusted the same as any other paying client. We are ninjas, the soldiers of our world. We possess physical strengths, that Gandalf tells me you do not, that allow us to perform taijutsu. In addition, we are able to utilize chakra for our techniques of ninjutsu and genjutsu. To Sakura and Naruto his speech was straightforward, but Gandalf knew their terms meant nothing to the assembled listeners. The hobbits, he noted with some amusement, looked excited to be faced with such exoticism. Gimli, Boromir and even Aragorn had opened their ears at Sai's description of his comrades as soldiers, such a thing appealing to them. Legolas was reserving judgment for a time. His first loyalty would always lie with his kin, and he would respect Elrond's caution. Hoping that the enthusiasm of the younger members of the assembly would win over their elders, he began to explain. Taijutsu is physical fighting. Our friend Sai uses a sword. I believe they call the style of blade a katana, while Naruto and Sakura prefer a smaller dagger, called a kunai. I have seen ninjas training with each other, and their skill, speed and dexterity is second to none. Ninjutsu is as magic. Here he paused as Merry and Pippin gasped in delight. From what I was permitted to see, it allows them to utilize shadows to create forms that take their likeness, or to hide themselves in the shape of other things. They can also cling to surfaces that would defeat the nimblest elf, and even walk on the surface of the water as if it were a path. Naruto desperately wanted to interject and state that they had far more skills than what Gandalf had been shown during his time at the academy, but Sakura was giving him the pinch look that meant he had to show restraint. The company around them did not look as impressed as the hobbits. Sakura couldn't fault them that reaction. Tsunade had said skills such as their own were completely unheard of. It would have proven their present company extremely gullible had they been immediately believed. Elrond had stated as they had arrived that he had cleared a space to be used for demonstrating some small tricks to prove their worth. Kakashi had told them firmly before they left that to avoid any undue attention they should play their cards very close to their chests. It was this same reason that Gandalf had been taken to the academy rather than the training grounds of real ninjas. Sai took a moment to realize that her jostling of his arm was to get him to suggest they give their demonstration before anyone present thought to ask what genjutsu entailed. To races with no defense mechanisms, the knowledge that the mind could be used against them in such a way would be unsettling, interfering with the trust that their charges would have to place in them. It was clear that only the hobbits seemed unaware that Gandalf had not finished his explanation as they all left the table to head to one of the fields beyond the walls, but most seemed to recognize that Gandalf had his reasons. XXXXX. The space was a little smaller than Sakura would have liked, especially as their audience crowded them on all sides. It would have prevented her using her strength had that not been one of the first things to be vetoed for demonstration. She, Naruto and Sai took their places in the center of the circle as they noted many more elves than had been sitting with them at breakfast had chosen to join them. Gandalf's list provided them with an optimum set of techniques to show off, and they were relieved he hadn't mentioned any of the more unsavory skills they all possessed. Sai stepped forward, unsheathing the standard ANBU issue katana that he had picked up from under his seat as they left the breakfast table. The smooth blade would never be able to compete with the huge broadswords he had noticed Aragorn and Boromir wielding, but speed and sharpness were as important. As the crowd murmured quietly to itself regarding the sword and its owner's practiced stance, Naruto picked up a solid branch from under one of the trees nearby. Returning to the circle, he handed one end to Sakura and they stood before Sai. With a nod from Gandalf to proceed, he brought the katana down in a powerful swing that sheared the limb in two cleanly. The shocked gasp from their audience was almost worth the superior looks that had been passed down their way by their hosts. Sakura and Naruto certainly thought so. They weren't entirely sure Sai had noticed them. Once the noise had abated, and the ends of the branch had been thoroughly investigated, Naruto stood proudly ready to demonstrate his infamous shadow clone technique. Gandalf had prefaced his display by explaining how it could be used for scouting, distraction, or simply as another sword in battle, although it would be destroyed by the first impact of a weapon. Sakura took a moment to observe Naruto as several clones popped in and out of existence in clouds of white smoke to the delight of the watching people. He had come so far since the troubled boy whose clone had never made it past the pale heap on the floor of their classroom. The crowd reeled and gasped as the clones moved all as one, then independently, then turned into copies of some within the crowd itself. They could see Boromir practically sitting on Merry and Pippin to prevent them running over to investigate the perfect copies of themselves as Gimli puffed on his pipe and chuckled as his double did the same. Even Elrond and his advisors seemed more at ease and perhaps as far as amused at Naruto's antics. He had always had a way of encouraging doubters to his side. Once Naruto finished, she realized that all eyes were on her as they expected her to show her talents. She was sure Gandalf knew of her healing but was less sure of who else knew. They seemed only interested in warriors, so perhaps it had not been considered worth showing despite the use it would have for the journey. Doing her best not to sigh, she walked towards a tall thin tree, the crowd parting as water around her, as she did. On reaching the base of the tree she did not stop, simply taking a step up onto the bark and keeping walking, holding herself perfectly horizontal as she climbed. Climbing trees would always be bittersweet as it represented the potential she had waited so long to explore, as she had been too busy with thoughts of the traitor. Judging by the excited noises coming from below her, her feet seemed even to have topped Naruto's. Perhaps this was something that had more meaning for them as they recognized climbing a tree far more than creating clones of themselves. Deciding that she was due a little return for her extremely good behavior in the face of derogatory looks and whispering, she smirked. Then she kicked off from the branch, twisted in midair and landed on the ground as softly as if she had merely taken a step rather than leaping from 20 feet. The men, dwarves and hobbits present burst into applause, and the elves she passed as she returned to her place with her boys inclined their heads in a show of respect. Gandalf raised his eyebrows at Elrond as the three ninjas were surrounded and peppered with questions concerning what else they had the power to do. Elrond raised an amused eyebrow in return. They had certainly proven they had talent. However, it still remained to be seen if talents such as theirs would be enough. He was certain this was the merest hint of what they were capable of. The dark-haired child especially had a feel about him that set him aside as ruthless in a way the other two lacked, but would it protect Frodo? After all, there were many unknown obstacles between the ring-bearer and his destination, and he could not be sure these ninjas were the only things to have made the journey to Middle-earth. The ninjas were kneeling on the floor of Elrond's study with the hobbits, as the other members of the fellowship had taken to the more comfortable seats. When offered a perch on the low-slung benches they had declined, citing that this was the way they always sat. Naruto, and Sai with crossed legs and Sakura with her legs folded under herself. They had been there for several hours as Elrond and Gandalf briefed them on their mission. It was perhaps the most fluid assignment they had ever been presented with, and for Sai it sat uncomfortably. He would never fully shake the strictly regimented life he had known under Root, and could not enjoy the supposed freedom Tsunade had gifted them regarding this world. She had been unwilling to send what remained of Team 7. This mission was beyond S-class. The dangers unknowable and the intelligence almost non-existent, but there was no one capable of adapting quite like Naruto. With Sakura as his voice of reason and Sai as his strategic advisor, Naruto was a nigh-on unstoppable force. Sai suspected there was another reason Naruto had been chosen, beyond the reason Tsunade had outlined. Sakura had been restless in the previous weeks, nervous even. Whenever she left the Hokage Tower her expression was grimmer and more shadowed. Despite Kakashi's teachings, Naruto still tended to take words and actions at their face value, and Sai still struggled with identifying the more subtle emotions of others. Therefore she had not felt the need to lie as convincingly as she might have with others when they asked how she fared. Naruto had accepted her excuses of extra shifts at the hospital, or a new training regime, or the other legitimate-sounding reasons she had given. However, Sai had been improving his social interactions, and saw enough to be suspicious. ANBU had also been unusually busy, yet he and Naruto had not been sent on more missions than normal. Medics were rarely sent on solo missions at their level due to the dangers inherent, and the lack of that particular talent in the ranks. Sakura had been on at least 2 in the month before they left to come to Middle-earth. Those were only the ones he had been able to find out about from fellow members of their organization. He had a feeling they were being obtuse with him on purpose, but he could not see why. There was something going on in Konoha. Something important enough to prevent Kakashi being assigned to this mission, and enough that even Sai had been able to read. The relief on Sakura's face when she knew Naruto would be far from it. Gandalf was pointing at a large map that hung from the ceiling, still embroiled in a disagreement over the spread of Isengard with Elrond, so Sai collected his thoughts to focus on later. Gandalf had started by informing them of the free peoples who populated this land, the men, elves, dwarves and hobbits, and the lands they called home. Then he had moved on to the enemy. Sauron. It had been a difficult task to describe their foe, as the ninjas had no knowledge of the Iluvatar, the Vala, the Mayor or Melkor. As such things formed part of the deepest and most fundamental workings of Arda. Even Elrond had never thought how to educate someone on such a matter, and it was this that had taken most of the morning. The ninjas were not entirely sure of how to classify Sauron, but were content with some basic knowledge. From there it had been less complicated to discuss the common enemies: orcs, goblins, wargs, Haradrim, pirate raiders, and the dangers they posed. In some ways the stark differences between those they had to protect and those they must fight was a comfort for the ninjas. So used to unraveling deceptions from their very human foes, it was something of a relief to have a clearly defined enemy. Of course that did not mean there were no traitors in this land. The description of Saruman was what had led to the debate currently happening around them. There was something more familiar about Saruman, one who had been a trusted companion, leader, mentor and friend, who was then revealed to have been working for personal gain all along without a care for who was hurt in the process. Though similar to Gandalf in that he was in the body of an old man, his power far exceeded the physical limitations of such a form. Gandalf had confided in them that his most powerful weapons were his words, which could ensnare the minds of mortals. The ninjas shared a look at this piece of information, silently agreeing that Sakura would take point should it come to a confrontation with the White Wizard. One of her main strengths had remained her ability to cast and break genjutsu, and Saruman's spells sounded like such. Should the ring fall into Saruman's grasp, it will find its way to its master within hours. The Palantir would serve him ill. Would he attempt to use the ring for his own purposes? Perhaps, and it would turn on him as surely as it turned on Isildur. As I said before, it recognizes no other master. Nodding to her companion, Sakura held up a hand and all eyes turned to her. "Forgive my interruption," she said, "but we wish to know more about the ring. You speak as if it were a living thing." The ring had been briefly mentioned during their lesson on Sauron, how his life force was tied to it, and that he could not be destroyed until the ring was no more. However, there had been no more in-depth mentions of it beyond that it had to be cast into the fires of Mount Doom. Gandalf tapped his as yet unlit pipe against his lip as he considered how best to approach the subject. Elrond inclined his head to question if he may be allowed to answer. Gandalf nodded, though still appeared reserved on the matter. "We must know all. Lack of information will cost life," Sai stated firmly, sensing the reluctance to reveal the full extent of their knowledge on the matter. Sakura gave him a calculating look from his side, and he realized he may have given her cause to wonder just how well his social skills were progressing. He almost smiled. Sakura was the most invested in his emotional well-being and was always ecstatic to see perceived improvements. However, in this case it was his root interrogation training that served him. Elrond and Gandalf perhaps wished to soften their words, not for their sake, but for that of Frodo. However, such coddling could not be allowed given the dangers ahead. Elrond frowned imperceptibly but continued, "The ring has some form of sentience as it is tied to Sauron. The only thing it desires is to return to him. It has terrifying power, but it only works for its own ends. It poisoned the minds of those who held it, while it waited for favorable circumstances. It gave the creature Gollum life far beyond the normal time, but at the cost of truly living. It kept Frodo's Uncle Bilbo in robust health well into his twilight years, but altered his moods and gave him a deep, obsessive attachment that he will never truly escape. It manipulates those around it by whispering, promising whatever they desire." Naruto twisted slightly to observe Frodo, who had taken to wearing the ring on a chain around his neck once it became his responsibility. Frodo flinched slightly under such an intense gaze, but it was not the hobbit that interested the ninja. "It whispers?" he asked, looking rather skeptically at where the ring lay heavily against Frodo's chest beneath his shirt. Gandalf nodded gravely when Naruto turned back to face him. "Yes, it speaks a dark tongue the like of which is too ugly for these halls, but the words themselves are as nothing to the feeling of them, the sense." "Has it spoken to you?" Naruto asked, still finding the tense changes of the common tongue more of a challenge than his companions. "Indeed it has. I cannot touch the ring, but I have heard its voice impressing on me the power I could wield should I only use it," Gandalf replied. Other members of the fellowship nodded and spoke in the affirmative. They had all heard the ring reach out to them, testing them for weakness and an easily corruptible purpose. Boromir shifted uncomfortably. He had not wished to reveal the ring's attempts to sway him, but the way Sai had insisted on all those involved being privy to the same information had struck a chord in him. The true strength of any collective relied on effective communication. How often had a campaign failed and lives of his men lost for the want of information? How often had he brought sad tidings to the friends and families of those struck down in the service of Gondor for the want of fresh reconnaissance? Nay, he would not conceal this to spare his pride when it could lead to the downfall of his home. "It speaks to me often." Boromir paused as they turned to him. He lowered his eyes to avoid meeting theirs. "At first it promised me wealth beyond the reckoning of even the kings of old, and I felt little." Aragorn smiled then, a feeling of camaraderie easing the tension around his heart when Boromir had started speaking. The others were sharing a look of confusion, so he spoke to show his support of Boromir's choice to admit to this. "Wealth that holds little appeal for a true soldier." Boromir smiled bitterly down at the clenched fists on his lap. "Aye, and so for a while it was quiet. Then it began again. It shows me the destruction of Gondor, of lives lost on my account, and the spread of the darkness our blood has kept in check. It tells me that I must use it, that all will be as dust if I do not. It fills my head so that I cannot think and fills my heart with such sorrow and rage that I feel I cannot bear it. Why does it target me so?" The experience was clearly painful, and Gandalf's expression was soft when he spoke. "It is because you are good and true, my boy. Ever has the will of Sauron been to corrupt the goodness left in this world. It targets you because you carry the weight of your home on your shoulders, and there is no limit on what a man will do to protect what he loves. You became a soldier when you had barely seen your 16th winter. You became Captain General hardly past your 21st. The fight against the darkness is all you have known, and with your father's rule failing, all look to you to protect them. Is this not so?" Boromir raised his eyes quickly to meet Gandalf's, and then returned them to his lap, unwilling to show just how that assessment had pierced his armor. Would they think him weak? A liability? Would he return in shame to face the father who bore such little resemblance to the man he remembered from childhood? Gandalf continued, although he chose to pace the room rather than focusing so intently on Boromir. "And so you see, my friends, that is the true and terrible power of the ring. It would convince Boromir that he is drowning, pulled under by the weight of what is expected of him, and that it would be his only hope. You must fight it, Boromir, it would only lead you to ruin. In the pause after Gandalf finished speaking, Sakura observed Aragorn, whose expression was of guilt on hearing the struggles of Boromir. However, any more thoughts on the matter would have to wait until Naruto had said his piece to the Gondorian. Naruto was no stranger to the desire to protect his home, and those he loved within it. The fact that the ring would attempt to twist such a pure-hearted goal into something that would spell the destruction of everything good could not have made him angrier had it been invented purely to do so. Boromir had won himself dogged support from Naruto, who Sakura suspected was projecting his unfilled desire to save Sasuke from the darkness onto the man. You are good, Boromir. You will succeed, Naruto announced, his bright smile the symbol of the hope and optimism that seemed to be tied to his presence. On seeing Boromir manage another of his lopsided smiles at having the full force of Naruto's friendship directed at him, Naruto nodded, satisfied for the moment. Boromir was heartened to see that Gimli gave him a nod of support, silently pledging his aid should it be required. Elrond and Gandalf shared an amused look while the other members of the fellowship looked on in slight bemusement. Sakura had mentioned to them that Naruto was known as the #1 most unpredictable ninja, but it was certainly something to see for themselves. Sai directed their attentions back to the present matter with the quiet observation that the ring had not spoken to him. Sakura and Naruto agreed. They had heard nothing from the seemingly innocuous object that hung around Frodo's neck. It is likely that it is confused with your presence. Just as you do not understand how it speaks to us, it does not understand where you have come from, so it cannot as yet formulate an approach, Elrond said thoughtfully. Gandalf's expression turned grim as he spoke. I would not expect this good fortune to last. You are our allies, and it will do whatever it is able to break the bonds that hold this company together. You must fight its influence, as Boromir must. Should you succumb to its effects, all may be lost. The ninjas nodded, still oddly in sync with each other. Sai glanced out of the window, and noticed the sun was getting lower in the sky, and soon those present would want to break for a meal. The hobbits, he had noticed, had snuck a variety of foodstuffs into the room and had been eating almost continually throughout. Naruto was also starting to fidget in the way he did when forced to sit still for long periods. Before the air of candor in the room was lost, he wished to start formulating a plan of attack. To destroy the ring is the final aim. What is the first objective? He asked. Sakura and Naruto cast him fond half-smiles as he spoke. The fellowship fell silent for a moment, the more strategically minded examining the map as if to puzzle a path in their minds that they must follow. Finally Aragorn spoke, choosing to voice his thought process aloud to involve the ninjas. We must head south, that much I know at least. If we reach the Gap of Rohan, we will be in safer lands. Theodred, Eomer and I were close in our boyhood, and they will aid our passage south, Boromir added, confident in his friendships with the Horse Lords despite his father's fears. Gandalf frowned. I have heard dark rumors of an evil that sweeps Rohan. No doubt it is Saruman's doing, but we may find that land is not safe as it once was. The Gap takes us too close to Isengard. If Saruman has succumbed to madness, then he will have the lands watched, Aragorn noted. The ninjas shared a gaze, communicating without words while the fellowship continued to debate. What do the scouts report? Asked Boromir, keen to push the idea of crossing through Rohan into Gondor and unwilling to let the matter go easily. The creatures of the enemy are multiplying. Elladan and Elrohir were accosted by a lone warg far closer to the border of these lands than ever before, Elrond informed them. Aragorn chewed his lip. His brothers had told him this, and he thought this then also. A lone warg is a rare thing. Aye, and they said it was in health, well fed and uninjured, not one driven from a pack, Legolas mused. He'd also discussed this matter at length with the twins. The darkness can call on the aid of all fell creatures. Our journey will be perilous, Gandalf added, more for the benefit of the ninjas than the others. Gimli had moved from his seat and approached the map. He was less experienced in the dealings of unintelligent creatures than the elves and elfkin, snorting softly to himself, as he remarked to himself they had plenty of call for it what with living with each other. Tracing the passage south with his eyes, he alighted on a possible safe port. Turning, he addressed the room, which was still debating the intricacies of a warg pack over the heads of the ninjas and hobbits. What of Moria? My cousin Balin would gladly shield our passage should we call on him. We can approach Mordor from there, avoiding the Gap altogether. The dead silence that met his words was a shock to the dwarf, as it was to the ninjas and the hobbits. All the color had drained from Legolas' face, and even Gandalf looked haunted by something only he could see. Naruto looked to Boromir, but even he did not seem to understand what scared the others so. Finally Gandalf spoke. Nay, Gimli, I would not travel through that place unless I had no other choice. On seeing the dwarf settle into a sturdier stance to argue, he continued, no one has had word from Balin in many years. You cannot bring the ring-bearer to such an uncertain place. I admit I fear that place. There are more than just orcs in the deep places of the world. We have a solution. Sakura's firm statement prevented the situation from degenerating and drew all attention to her. Sai took over, sensing that as much as they respected Sakura, they would take better subconsciously to a plan outlined by a man. Naruto merely nodded at the appropriate moments during Sai's explanation to add his weight behind it. You will go to the Gap of Rohan. If you will give us a map, we will leave first and advance ahead of you. We will, here he paused searching for the correct word, dispose of Saruman and clear this gap for you to pass. Then we will rejoin you and go into Rohan together. There was a long pause as the other members tried to work such a plan through in their heads. It was Gandalf who spoke first. My friends, Saruman is a powerful enemy. I have no doubt you are strong, but you could not hope to succeed by force. Elrond's brow was creased fiercely. Nay, it is folly. Naruto momentarily forgot all of the decorum Tsunade and Sakura had been pounding into him for when he took over as Hokage, and rolled his eyes. We're not going to fight our way in. Thankfully Naruto had forgotten to speak in the common tongue, and while he was distracted nursing his near-broken ribs from Sakura's heavy elbowing fought to smooth relations over. Forgive Naruto, Elrond-sama. You speak of the shadows as your enemy, but to a ninja they are a friend. We would enter his lands in secrecy and kill him without alerting his servants, much less his warriors. It will be an assassination, and it will not be glorious, but he is too dangerous a foe. He would not fight you with honor, so there is no reason to extend to him the courtesy. You can do that? Pippin asked, his eyes wide. Ninjas have always done the necessary but distasteful work, Sakura informed them, her voice solemn. She could see that this had shaken the fellowship's perceptions of them, but Sai was right. Saruman was too dangerous to be faced in the honorable combat of which these warriors were so fond. Gimli and Boromir seemed almost affronted by the plan, but had been fighting the forces of darkness so long as to recognize the sense of the matter. Aragorn and the elves seemed of the opinion that it simply could not be done. The hobbits looked rather ill on being faced with the realities of a war. Do you truly believe you will succeed? Asked Gandalf. Sai inclined his head. I do, Gandalf. We will travel light and arrive perhaps many days in advance of the fellowship. We will wait at the gap if we are successful and retrace our path and find you should we fail. I do not like it. We will be too far behind to provide aid should you need it. Boromir was rubbing his beard and attempting to work out the traveling speed of a fellowship where 5 members had short legs. Gimli nodded in agreement. We should not need aid, as they should not even know we are there. Naruto grinned at him, giving him the strange gesture of a curled fist and upwards thumb again. You are actually considering such a plan, Boromir? Aragorn asked, his tone shocked. The real folly would be to not utilize the skills they possess. Why should they be here if we would treat them the same as any from this land? Gimli stated firmly. He had been very impressed with the skills they had shown the previous day, even if he did consider such smoke and dagger techniques personally distasteful. Saruman was a dishonorable opponent, and he saw no reason why honorable blood should be shed when he could be dealt with by their new allies. The others hummed in agreement. It was a sensible point. Interrupting before a new wave of arguments could begin, there was a knock at the door, and an elf advised them dinner was being laid on the table. Elrond nodded, and once the servant had departed he addressed the ninjas. We will consider this plan, but I do not agree to it. Sai smiled blandly, the unnatural fake smile he used when he wished to display annoyance. With all due respect, Elrond-sama, we will carry out this plan. Our mission is to aid you, and we have been given clearance to do whatever we see fit to ensure you are safe. We will need more information about Saruman and his fortification. Naruto clapped a hand on Sai's shoulder as he stood up and stretched. Do not worry, Elrond-sama. We are the best. Believe it. Elrond remained displeased, but he could see that Gandalf and Aragorn were giving the plan serious consideration. If it were possible that they could succeed, it could well change their fortunes in this war. XXXXX. It was that night when Sakura first heard it. A dark whisper inside her mind. The fellowship had returned to Elrond's study after their meal and continued to iron out any flaws in their plan of action. Gandalf had advised them that they would wait until the last of Elrond's scouts returned before they set off. The ninjas would leave a day or two before the fellowship to ensure that there was enough time for the plan to be enacted and backup action to be taken should it fail. They had retreated to bed long after night had fallen, and the oil was low in the lamps. It was now the middle of the night, judging by the weak moonlight pouring through her window, and Sakura was awake. Her skin was crawling and she felt restless enough that she could barely contain herself. It seemed Gandalf had been right that it was only a matter of time before the ring overcame its confusion at their presence, and started its attempts at corruption. She could not understand how Boromir faced down this feeling without going mad. Pulling on one of the soft robes the elves had given her, she crept to the door, and opened it. Sai and Naruto were sharing a bedroom across the hall from her, and she eased herself inside as silently as a shadow. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could Sai was already awake, his knees pulled up to his chest and his arms around them. Naruto was snoring away happily, sprawled across his bed as a starfish. Settling herself at Sai's side, she leant against his headboard. You hear it too? She whispered. Yes, he answered. What does it say to you? That if I do not take it, terrible things will happen. That I will lose you, Naruto, and all that I have gained since I was given to Team 7. That I will be alone again. Oh, Sai. Sakura breathed, and laying her head on his shoulder and taking his hand, you will never be alone again. Even if something happens to me and Naruto will always be in your heart. You aren't getting rid of us that easily. He huffed a soft laugh and squeezed her hand, reveling in her support, and looking fondly at the still sleeping Naruto. What does it say to you? The same. That I was not strong enough to save Sasuke, so how could I be strong enough to protect anyone else I love? It lies, Sai. There is nothing I wouldn't do to keep you and Naruto, and Kakashi and Tsunade and Ino-Pig and everyone else safe. I don't need it to know that. You never have to do anything alone, he stated softly. Sakura gave him a watery smile. as if I can do anything without you two idiots being involved. And that's how it will stay. Do you think it speaks to Naruto? I don't think so. Even Naruto wouldn't be able to sleep through it. You know Naruto though, he'll probably end up convincing it to drop this world domination stuff and become friends with him. Should we tell him? We have to, but I think it can wait till morning. Getting up, she pulled Sai over to Naruto's bed and shuffled the sleeping ninja over to one side so the two of them could get in beside him. It spoke volumes of how much Naruto trusted them that he barely woke up except to murmur it was too early, and they were not to steal his covers. Surrounded by her two closest friends, Sakura was able to ignore the low-level buzz of awareness of the ring and fall asleep. It took Sai a little longer, as he was disappointed he had not pushed Sakura to tell him what was happening back in Konoha. However, he had time enough to figure out that puzzle and so drifted off to the sounds of the deep, even breathing of his friends. Sakura had been right that the ring had not spoken to Naruto during the night. In the morning he was bright-eyed and nothing seemed amiss. The three of them were so used to sharing a bed in unfamiliar territory that Naruto had not thought to be suspicious of something more. The ring had evidently been active over the last hours, as Boromir too appeared to be suffering from a lack of sleep and struggled to rein in his temper at breakfast. After Naruto had eaten, they took him aside into the gardens to discuss the matter of the ring. Gandalf had explained the deep affection elves have for all things that grow, and Elrond's gardens were spectacular. Even Naruto, who rarely had the time for plants, was impressed, and there was something soothing in the wooded glades of Elrond's woods. They had all been skeptical when Gandalf had mentioned that elves could speak to the trees, but there was definitely a feeling of sentience in the air. It was not at all like the heavy, oppressive claustrophobia of the ring. Instead, it was light and airy with the sense of incredible age, much like the bearing of elves themselves. Finding a suitable stone bench within viewing distance of Elrond's palace, they settled themselves. Sai was rapidly filling up his sketch pad with drawings of the elves and their home, as well as the members of the fellowship, and it would not be long before he ran out of space for his beautiful designs. Naruto hovered over his shoulder as Sakura contemplated how best to broach the subject. Though she was sure Elrond's house guard were under orders from their lord to watch them at all times, it mattered little. Their language was incomprehensible to their new allies, and this would no doubt prove its use many times over the next months. Naruto? Sakura asked, worrying her lip between her teeth. Yeah, Sakura-chan, what's the matter? Did you sleep well last night? Naruto cocked his head to the side as he considered her question, his bright eyes focused on her as he attempted to puzzle out what she meant. Yes, why? No strange dreams? No noises? Sai had momentarily stopped sketching to listen more intently to Naruto's answer. No, nothing. Naruto's face twisted in confusion at Sakura's strange questions. He had often suffered from night terrors when he had been a boy, but as he'd aged his dreams had lost much of their potency. Sai and Sakura shared a look as Naruto continued, his hand coming up to ruffle his soft blonde locks as he thought aloud. But Kyuubi was really angry this morning. He's sulking right now. The ring spoke to us, Sai offered as he saw Sakura deep in thought. What? Roared Naruto, upsetting the tree full of birds above them and sending them spiraling upwards squawking in displeasure. Naruto! Keep your voice down! Snapped Sakura, distracted from her train of thought. Sorry Sakura-chan. What did it say? Why didn't it speak to me? Naruto was not aggrieved that he had been somehow left behind as he would have done when he was younger, more thoughtful and worried for his two closest friends. Basically what it said to Boromir. It plays on our worst fears and manipulates our feelings. It is powerful, Sai stated slowly, trying to speak calmly to avoid triggering any panic in Naruto. Sakura tapped a finger to her lips, narrowing her eyes at Naruto. Maybe you can't hear the ring because of Kyuubi. That would make sense, Naruto. Perhaps it cannot compete with the Kyuubi's presence in your mind, Sai theorized, also looking at Naruto despite the Kyuubi's existence being hidden. Naruto folded his arms as he settled into his familiar thinking stance. It would explain why he's in such a bad mood. It's bad enough he's stuck in here. He's never liked sharing. This makes you our most valuable asset during this journey. If it cannot reach you, it cannot harm you. Should we inform the fellowship? Sakura smiled at her friend. Of course Naruto would be different to anyone else in this world. Sai frowned, flying birds taking shape under his hands without his even watching them. I don't believe that is a good idea. This knowledge may prove vital in future, and the fewer who are aware of it means fewer sources from which the enemy can discern it. Also, how would we explain the Kyuubi to them? I worry it would bear too close a resemblance to the enemies they most fear, and they may not have faith in the seal that holds him. You're probably right, Sai. Maybe we can explain Kyuubi as a guardian spirit, or something similar should they learn of him? Sakura wondered. Naruto's face twisted into a wry smile. He's laughing at that, Sakura-chan. At least he's out of his sulk. We'll cross that bridge if we come to it. Someone's coming, said Sakura, angling her head in the direction they would appear. Frodo and Sam walked into their clearing to find the ninjas sitting in the autumn sunlight that seemed to pervade all of Rivendell. They immediately dropped their eyes and murmured apologies on finding themselves alone in the presence of their intimidating new companions. Frodo, Sam, join us. Naruto encouraged, gesturing to the long, soft grass next to him. Sakura and Sai were poised on the bench, and she smiled gently at the hobbits who inched forward timidly. They did not seem inclined to be the first to break the somewhat awkward silence, so Sakura spoke in the tone her companions recognized as the one she used when speaking to patients at the hospital. Sam, you are. She could not remember the word for gardener so adapted. You know of the plants here? Sam nodded, still avoiding his gaze with something of a red flush around his ears and neck. Yes ma'am, lot of these here plants don't grow in the Shire, but I reckon I know a good deal of the rest. I am sure Gandalf said I am a medic? Sakura asked, smiling down at the bashful gardener and amused to note Frodo doing the same. Yes ma'am, but I wasn't all that sure what he meant by that. Sakura laughed. It was a genuine sound and not mocking as Sam had feared. I think you would call me a healer? I often use the properties of plants to create antidotes and medicines. Would you be able to help me learn the most useful? Sam looked inordinately pleased by the request. He, Merry and Pippin were often treated as something of an afterthought at best or excess baggage at worst. Maybe they had not realized quite the scale of the task ahead when they had demanded to accompany their fellow hobbit, but as Sam's old gaffer had always said, any job is worth seeing to the end. It was difficult for him to relate the ninja as they sat in front of him with their ruthless talk of assassinating the wizard. Such things were beyond unknown in the Shire, and Sam could not say he was glad to have found out they existed. It must take a queer sort, he thought to himself, that could manage to live in that way and keep their minds. Frodo seemed calmed by their presence though, and he could find no fault with that. Privately he thought it was because they had helped develop the plan the Fellowship was to follow, and the fewer uncertainties there were the calmer Frodo became. The most important, for healing that is, I reckon to be King's foil ma'am. Until I met Strider I thought it was a weed, always grows in the midst of the mushroom crop and disturbs them. But when Mr. Frodo here was injured by those black riders, Strider chewed it up, and it saved Mr. Frodo's life. Black riders? Naruto asked. Oh, the Nazgul, sir. They stabbed Mr. Frodo with one of their cursed blades and near turned him into one of them. Frodo nodded uncomfortably, clutching the scar in his shoulder. Elrond had saved him from a fate worse than death, but the wound still ached fiercely and he felt as though the cold that radiated from it would never leave him. You are hurt? Let Sakura see. Naruto reached out to tug Frodo's shirt away from the wound, but Sai tapped him on the shoulder to stop him. Naruto was an extremely physical person, but Sai had observed that such behavior was not appreciated by any except close friends in this world. Sakura slid off the bench and towards the hobbits with serpentine grace. She could tell Frodo would much rather he kept the wound private, but they could have nothing compromising the ring-bearer, and thus endangering the mission. Kneeling before him she gestured for him to pull down the collar of his shirt. Sam's brow was creased with concern, but he would not protest anything that might aid Frodo's recovery. The wound was raised, dark and ugly despite the time spent healing, and it immediately made Sakura anxious. With her hand close to it she could feel the roiling of an unfamiliar corruption, and attempting to introduce her chakra to it could have devastating consequences. Biting her lip she leaned back away from Frodo and cracked her knuckles, a clear sign of nervousness that her companions picked up on. Sakura-chan? Naruto asked, trying to lean around her to see for himself. I am sorry, Frodo. I dare not attempt to heal this without consulting Elrond. I have no experience of curse wounds in this world and I would not wish to make this worse. Sakura bowed in apology as Frodo covered it again. Could it be sealed? Sai asked, the unspoken like Sasuke's, hanging heavily in the air. Sakura sighed, perhaps. On seeing the confusion of the hobbits she added, a seal is a magical barrier that would prevent the infection from manifesting itself. However, it is a complicated process, and would not be confident to perform such a procedure without my teacher. Ma, I want Kakashi could have come. Naruto sighed, he is good at seals. I think in this context the common tongue would be wish Kakashi could have come, interjected Sai, attempting to distract the hobbits before they questioned them on Kakashi. The copy ninja was too vital an asset to the village to be discussed in detail out with it. Frodo was sharp and accepted the change of subject, possibly thinking that the less he learned of the ninja's world the happier he would be. You speak well for only having learned this language in such a short time, he commented lightly. We are trained to have an excellent memory for detail from when we are children. It helps, despite the complexity of your language, said Sai. Frodo smiled at the wry expressions on the faces of the ninja. Language had always fascinated him, and he hoped that if they had the time he might learn some of theirs. It was an interesting tongue, and could not be harder than attempting to learn Quenya. I am sorry, Sam, I did not let you finish your description of King's foil, said Sakura, retaking her place on the bench and nodding for Sam to continue. It has broad, hoary leaves that almost look like blades and they have a clean smell, like fresh bedding or the air after a shower, said Sam. As Sam spoke, Sai and the other two ninjas straightened up slightly as they felt others approach them. My father has Athelas growing near the healing pavilion should you wish to see it. A bright, clear voice spoke after Sam had finished. It belonged to the most beautiful woman the ninjas had ever seen. Her hair was dark, her skin luminescent, and her eyes shone like the stars in the night sky. Her pointed ears showed she was elf-kind and her dress was woven with shimmering threads so as to look like the plumage of a bird. Her hand rested on Aragorn's arm and he smiled at her with undisguised fondness in his eyes. My friends, this is Arwen Undermeal. She is Elrond's daughter and sister to Eladan and Elrohir. I do not believe you have yet been introduced. Arwen, this is Naruto, Sai and Sakura. Aragorn pointed to the three ninjas in turn who stood and bowed to her deeply in greeting. It is a pleasure to meet those who risk their lives for the safety of this land, said Arwen. You are very beautiful, Naruto said smiling. She reminded him of someone, but he could not bring to mind who. Thank you, Naruto. Arwen inclined her head slightly, smiling as she saw the hobbits look on in awe at Naruto for being so forward. You said your father has Athelas? Is that King's foil? Asked Sakura, before any more compliments could spill out of Naruto. It was evident that there was more to Aragorn and Arwen's relations than adoptive brother and sister. It was clearly written in the way they angled into each other, and the way they looked at one another. Yes, it is often used in elvish medicine, although it is more potent in the hands of a king, said Arwen, smiling broadly at Aragorn as she did so. How does a king affect it so? Asked Sakura. It is an old folktale. Come Athelas, life to the dying. In the king's hand lying it may come from the blood of the Númenórean kings of old. It is said they learned many things from the Eldar, and perhaps the use of Athelas came from them. You are descended from this line, are you not? Asked Sai. Legolas had described Aragorn as the king of Gondor during their first lessons on this world. Aragorn inclined his head, although it was clearly not a topic he wished to discuss. Sensing this, Sakura motioned to Frodo. How does your father heal wounds such as Frodo's? A mortal knife is a devastating weapon. Shards remain within the wound, allowing the dark magic to flow within the body of the injured. Elrond was able to remove the shard that would have turned Frodo into a wraith, and his healing spells reversed the curse damage. However, I know very little of the actual spells my father uses. They are beyond my skills, said Aragorn. Sakura nodded, and Arwen was asking Sai if she may look at his sketchbook that still lay open on his lap when an elf guard appeared from the trees. My lord, lady, honored guests, Elrond requests your presence in his study. The elf bowed and returned the way he came. The ninjas stood and followed Aragorn and Arwen, keeping the hobbits safely in between them. On the way they met with Boromir, Gimli, Merry and Pippin, who had received a similar summons and were following their messenger. The two warriors fell naturally into step with the ninjas and Sakura, and Sai shared a look over Naruto's head as he chatted to Merry and Pippin. Sai nodded, and he and Sakura fell back slightly, and let the others gain a little distance before speaking to Boromir. Boromir, we would speak with you when this meeting is concluded, said Sai, his eyes fixed ahead as if to give the impression the matter was of little importance. Aye, friends, what troubles you? Boromir replied in kind, keeping his tone even and light as his deep voice carried easily. The same that troubles you, said Sakura. Boromir ground his teeth together and nodded, understanding immediately. When they reached the door to Elrond's study, he held the door, and allowed the two ninjas to pass before following them inside and taking up his usual place near the dwarf. Elrond was not alone as he had been during their previous meetings in this room. A group of 4 elves, all in travel-worn clothes, stood by his writing table. Although their garments spoke of a hard journey, their faces bore little fatigue, and they stood proudly without the heaviness of travel. The ninja heard Gimli mutter elves in an exasperated tone and forced themselves not to smile as Elrond turned to them, clearly having heard the dwarf as well. However, he said nothing and bowed to them, introducing the elves as the near-last scouting party to return. On a gesture from his lord, the leader of the party stepped forward to give his report. The forces of the enemy are massing. I fear they realize just what resides here in Rivendell. However, they have not yet made passing impossible. Elrond nodded gravely. You must not linger too long here lest they prevent travel altogether. I would suggest that you set out within 3 or 4 days. The ninjas nodded to each other. We will depart tomorrow evening, stated Sai. What creatures are we likely to encounter? We located warg tracks. My lord tells me Lords Eladan and Elrohir saw a lone male. We believe we have found his pack. It is much closer to Rivendell than a pack has ever come before. We also located an orc campsite. Although it would be difficult to approximate numbers, I would expect at least a dozen, perhaps more, the leading elf recounted. Naruto glanced around the room to take in the mood of his companions. Those with fighting experience were weighing their skills against the numbers while considering the hobbits who would need to be protected. The hobbits were looking anxiously around at their fellows until Naruto caught their eye and gave them a sunny smile. So long as they remained with the fellowship, no harm would befall them, of that he was sure. Sakura looked unconcerned. He did not doubt she was a match for a dozen orcs on her own, as all the fighters in the room were. Gandalf had explained to them that the main danger of orcs were their numbers rather than their actual skills, except for their use of poison blades and arrows. Sai was thinking about something. The crease between his eyebrows was a giveaway that his monstrous intellect was focused on a problem. Elrond-sama, how many scouting parties are fit for 2 or 3 days' travel? Asked Sai, evidently having come to some sort of conclusion. 4, perhaps 5, for what purpose? Elrond asked. He was still reserved over the manner the ninja were prepared to act in, but could not deny they had experience that would prove invaluable. We intend to leave in secret, but that will be more of a challenge for the fellowship itself with so many members. He neglected to add that few of the members were practiced in stealth. It may aid the fellowship to send several parties out at the same time in differing directions to thin the foes that are lying in wait. Elrond did not immediately react, considering the danger to the elves under his lordship. It will be dangerous, but I feel it will provide the best chance the fellowship has of slipping through the net being closed around us. Sai pressed his point further, seeing Elrond waver. Gandalf rose and crossed to the window where he felt he could light his pipe without offending the elves in the room. Gimli considered following, but Legolas was at the side of the room furthest from the window, and so would not be as irritated as Gimli would like him. Elrond was discussing the matter in a rapid elvish undertone with the recently returned scouts who would likely be needed to be fit in 3 days' time. Finally he faced the room again and agreed with Sai that the elvish scouting parties would reform and attempt to lead some of the enemies off the scent of the Fellowship. He dismissed the room with orders to fully prepare for the upcoming operation. The ninjas allowed the others to pass first, and lingered long enough for it to appear as though they were merely following Boromir out of the room rather than to the study, where the shards of Narsil lay. The study was quiet, bathed in light from its large windows, and Boromir often frequented it to look on the large wall paintings and observe the sword he had heard tales of all his life. On checking there was no one currently present, Boromir sank onto one of the chairs and bid the ninjas to continue. Sakura smiled at him, for all that he had expected to take his father's role as steward, and was quietly aggrieved that the king's line had reappeared in his lifetime so as to steal the role from him. The throne suited him ill. It was clear from his posture that he would never be content with ordering others to carry out his tasks, much preferring to be active himself. "The ring has spoken to us during the night," Sakura said in a quiet voice. Boromir nodded, looking at once relieved and angry that the ring was visiting its evil words upon another. "It pains me to hear that it haunts you, friends, but yet it gives me heart to know that you know of the feeling. I do not believe the others do, and they treat me as if I am fragile, as if this may break me." He slammed his fist down on the arm of the chair, the delicate wood groaning under the pressure, as he managed to keep his voice a harsh whisper. "Suppose we continue to fight the ring, might it move on to easier prey?" asked Sakura. Boromir contained himself. Evidently lack of sleep due to something he had no control over was affecting his temper. "It may, but then who is to say that it would not break the defenses of another, leading us all to ruin? There is little we can do, other than resist its influence. Its main weapon is despair, and despair is easier alleviated when one has someone in which to confide," said Sai. Boromir and Naruto nodded while Sakura smiled at him. That was a literal translation from one of his socializing books that he had so relied on when he was first given to them, as a blank slate. "We will support each other." Naruto put his hand in between them in a fist, much to Boromir's confusion. "You put your hand on top like so," Sakura laughed, placing hers flat on top of Naruto's closed fist. Boromir looked askance but did as instructed, laying his large palm over Sakura's hand while Sai laid his over Boromir's. "It is a bonding gesture that Naruto often employs when a group is tasked with a mission," Sai informed Boromir. The Gondorian laughed as they pulled their hands down and brought them back up into themselves with a small cheer, muted by the virtue of where they stood. His heart felt lighter knowing that he had comrades who understood. Comrades who were soldiers as he was and not of strange races he had little experience of and was unsure of how to act around, or for souls of innocence he did not dare darken before their time. For the first time since he had arrived at Rivendell he was not despairing of all that lay before him. Naruto was such a beacon in the darkness, he need not worry of losing his way so intensely. XXXXX. It was not long after they departed from the study that Elrond swept up to the sword that was broken. Reverently he laid a hand on the hilt of the blade that had been wielded by his companions and friends so many years before. Breathing a sharp sigh he flicked the fabric over the still sharp blade piece and carried the two sections to his forge. He was sure he was making the correct decision in reforming the blade. It was time for Aragorn to seize his destiny rather than hiding from it. The twilight was gathering as the ninjas prepared to leave Rivendell. After their talk with Boromir they had withdrawn to ensure their affairs were in order before they had to depart. With their packs full, weapons sharpened and redressed in their dark traveling gear, they stood at the gates of Elrond's palace for a final debrief. Sai held open the map Elrond had copied for them on parchment thick enough to withstand repeated folding out in the wilderness. In the interest of safety their route to Orthanc was not marked in the hope that they could conceal their purpose from their enemies until Saruman was eliminated. Aragorn, steeped in the knowledge of the area around his adoptive home, had indicated the most recognizable landmarks in order to keep the ninjas on track. In the presence of a ranger and an elf the Fellowship had little chance of losing their way on the journey south. Elrond feared that the same could not be said for the ninja who were completely foreign to such simple matters of the world as directional signs in the common tongue. Gandalf was reassuring. After all they had found their way to Rivendell without issue. The elves had estimated that it would take around 2 to 3 weeks for the Fellowship to reach the Gap of Rohan, if not more depending on the fortunes of the journey. The ninja, far more used to traveling under time constraints, could make the journey in around 2/3 of that time. With an extra 2 days ahead of the Fellowship there would be more than enough time to reach Isengard and plan their infiltration. Once the deed was done it would be a simple matter of avoiding Saruman's followers as they retreated to the Gap to await their comrades. Gandalf was sure that those under the wizard's command would scatter once their leader was dead. The ninjas were less easily convinced but were prepared to take Gandalf's word until they had investigated the situation to their satisfaction. The hobbits looked at once anxious that the ninja were leaving the safety of Rivendell and uneasy at the task that lay ahead of their new friends. They had discussed the matter of the planned assassination amongst themselves the previous evening. Although their conclusions had gone unsaid it was clear they all wished to remain as oblivious to the actions of the ninjas as they could. The other warriors of their acquaintance found the matter distasteful, running contrary to their personal ethics regarding combat, but the hobbits found it frightening. Pippin had been quick to defend the ninjas and pointed to the swords they had carried before entering Elrond's lands. They had been and would be in danger again that was not of their making and they would have to protect themselves to ensure their task was completed. The others had agreed for a moment until Mary very quietly reminded them that there was a difference between defending oneself and emerging from the shadows to strike down an unaware opponent. In the short time they had known the three ninjas, they had become comrades, friends, and it was difficult to imagine them as cold-hearted killers. There was surprisingly little comfort in the knowledge that Saruman would have a far quicker and less painful death than they if he was to catch them. The air around Gimli and Legolas was uncomfortable as the two had fallen into an argument earlier in the day that had become out of hand. Aragorn had caught them almost at each other's throats near the training grounds as Boromir attempted to separate them without success. The Gondorian had much experience pulling apart warring soldiers, but not in cases where the combatants felt the expectations of their races on their shoulders. Several things had been said that were not representative of their ages and maturity. Aragorn had been forced to strongly reprimand Legolas in Elvish while Boromir talked Gimli down from his frothing rage. The two men had come to an accord not to inform the others of this latest flare of hostilities between the elf and dwarf in the hope of preserving as much optimism for the quest as they could. Unfortunately, it was not possible to keep it from anyone when Gimli and Legolas insisted in having words with each other in the hallway outside Gandalf's room. The wizard had not been amused and had delivered a stern lecture on the dangers of the quest ahead and how the Fellowship could not suffer internal tensions in such dark times. He threatened that if they could not act like the adults they were, then they would be left behind, their spaces amply filled by the ninjas who had disappeared to avoid being pulled into the disagreements. Now they stood at opposite ends of the group, thoroughly chastened and with frosty expressions. Gandalf was still irritated over being forced to remonstrate with those far too old to be acting in such a way. Boromir and Aragorn merely looked weary at the prospect of facing more rowing during their journey, especially on so little sleep as they would be afforded. Elladan and Elrohir had felt honor-bound to support their fellow elf even if they secretly agreed with their father that the arguments were petty and ridiculous for the most part. Arwen had sensibly chosen not to involve herself beyond listening to Aragorn complaining of the incessant backbiting that was sure to occur in future. Elrond was too concerned with the ninjas to give the matter of internal rivalries much thought, but felt he would have to intervene before the Fellowship left his lands. Hearing the buzz of nighttime insects starting to fill the air, Naruto began shifting, eager to be on their way. Reaffirming their course for the last time with Elrond, Sai nodded and folded the map away onto the pocket on his chest under his cloak. The three then bowed deeply to their hosts and began fastening their porcelain masks to reconceal their identities. It was extremely unlikely that they would be recognized by the enemy, but their outlandish appearances would raise suspicion. If the elvish scouting parties were correct and the spies of the dark were everywhere, the less commotion they caused the better their chances of success. Saruman would not be unprotected and was anything but helpless, but if they could avoid adding to the wizard's guard, the easier their task would be. Naruto's mask was shaped into a snarling fox's muzzle with red and orange accents around the eyes for luck. Sai's was completely flat with heavily accented eyes and lips in the style of a kabuki mask. Sakura's was shaped like a dragon's maw, a fierce expression revealing many teeth. They had been given their masks when they had achieved ANBU rank, and the designs had been chosen by their superiors to show what they had revealed of themselves during the application process. They had shown them to each other and chose not to comment on how apt they were for fear of offending each other. When they pulled their hoods up to cover their hair and the final traces of their identities, the hobbits began to understand how they could carry out the acts they did. The anonymity afforded by their uniforms created a disconnection between what they were ordered to do by their village, and now to help destroy the ring, and their actual personalities. Bowing once again, they turned and walked through the gateway out towards the wilderness. The Fellowship followed to watch them leave, and there were several gasps of surprise as the ninjas suddenly accelerated to leap into the branches of the trees and disappeared from sight. Gandalf leant on his staff as Merry and Pippin rushed past him in an attempt to catch another glimpse of their new comrades. He understood the value, the sense, the necessity of what Sai had proposed, but he still found it lay uneasy with him. Saruman had been his oldest friend, his closest confidant, and once a being he had respected above all others. Although he was far beyond the reach of reason, it still pained Gandalf to know that he would no longer walk the earth as he had for so many ages of man. Saruman was more powerful than nearly any in Middle-earth, but only so far as wizarding combat went. He had known Gandalf so long he could read his movements with ease and would ensnare those of this company as they would have to approach him in the open. Gandalf could only hope he was not allowing the ninja to walk into a danger they could not overcome. By the tight expression on Elrond's face, he felt the same despite his initial reluctance to accept them. Slowly the group turned back to the palace to prepare for their own departures. XXXXX. After a few hours' travel, Naruto suddenly dropped into a dead stop, Sakura and Sai immediately falling into fighting stances behind him in response. While Naruto's sense of smell was not as adept as Kakashi's or Kiba's, it was superior to theirs, and he had caught the stench of something on the wind. They instinctively suppressed their chakra, although whatever was ahead of them was unlikely to sense it unless they actively tried to make them do so. However, Aragorn had spoken of wargs that seemed to have extrasensory perception above that of other creatures, and may have felt their chakra if they were molding it so their instincts would continue to serve them well. Naruto held up a fist, and they began to creep forward to investigate the source of the smell. Soon Sakura and Sai were able to smell it too, and soon wished they were downwind. It was a combination of rotting meat, rank body odor, and dank wet fabric. As the smell became stronger, they could hear voices, harsh, guttural voices that were speaking in a language they did not recognize. In the trees they moved silently forward in an attempt to identify the speakers before deciding what course of action to take. There were a group of creatures camped in a small clearing near a stream up ahead. The dawn was not far from breaking, and they seemed to be preparing to shelter from the light of day. From the descriptions the Fellowship had given them, they appeared to be orcs. They were shorter than most of the men and elves they had seen so far and were hunched, bandy-legged and twisted in strange ways. Their skin varied in color from almost translucent to almost black, and all were covered in ugly scars. Their eyes were the worst. With no discernible pupils and black, red or milky white in color rolling in often weeping sockets, they were unnervingly inhuman. Gandalf and Legolas had been fighting orcs for centuries and had passed on as much of their experience as they could in the short time they had available. Orcs tended to use crude weapons, often with fearsome ragged edges and always filthy, in the hope of creating a wound that could poison a warrior even if it was not immediately fatal. While they were cowardly, they loathed other races that were not loyal to Sauron, and were possessed of intense physical strength when they desired to destroy their opponents. They did use bows but were not renowned for their accuracy. However, the shafts they used were cruelly barbed, so if they landed a lucky shot it often caused terrible damage. Behind their masks the ninjas calculated the numbers and physical strengths against their own. Sai did not think this small band was the one that had made the camp the scouting party had seen. The elves had thought at least a dozen, but there only seemed to be half that in this group. It reassured him that he had made the correct decision in convincing Elrond to risk his subordinates to protect the Fellowship. There were clearly more and more enemies gathering. Naruto turned to his two comrades and raised his hand, palm up and fingers extended, in the universal sign for "what shall we do?" Sai motioned six, and Sakura pointed her thumb back the way they had come to remind them that the Fellowship would be following a similar path. Naruto tipped his head up to calculate the remaining hours of darkness. The orcs did not seem to be able to sense them despite their being in the trees merely a few feet away. But the daylight may give them away. Sakura put her hand to her face with her fingers curled to her thumb to indicate that at least two of the orcs carried horns. If they did not neutralize them immediately, then they could raise the alarm and they would be swiftly outnumbered. Orcs were not the most dangerous foe, but it was likely they could hold their ground until their reinforcements arrived. As they gestured, the orcs began to settle down to sleep, leaving the thinnest and most delicate-looking orc awake as their sentry. He did not have a natural warrior's build, but he had large bat-like ears and twitched fearfully at the slightest noise, his eyes rolling furiously in an attempt to identify it. Finally Sai shook his head and pointed to their path ahead. Naruto waved his arm frantically, the sign they had developed to allow him to express his exuberant personality without resorting to shouting. Sakura cocked her head to the side in an attempt to work out her comrade's reluctance to engage the enemy. Sai gestured to the path ahead again with more emphasis. Making a face that Sai couldn't see, Naruto nodded and led them slowly around and away from the orcs' campsite. Sai followed and Sakura brought up the rear, casting a final look at the orcs they had spared. Her friend had evidently seen a factor that they had not considered. His root training may have stunted his social development, but all its members had been masters of reading a tactical situation. It was how they had stayed undiscovered so long in a village full of ninja who opposed their very existence. Up ahead of her she could see Naruto's shoulders were tense. He enjoyed the challenge of measuring his strength against new opponents, and was disappointed that he was not allowed a chance after being cooped up so long in a regimented environment such as Rivendell. It was testament to the strength of the bond the two men had formed that Naruto was willing to cede on the matter. In their younger days he would have argued his course until the sun had risen. They had been traveling for near the whole night, and even if Naruto chose to push them harder to burn off his excess energy, it would not be long before they stopped, and Sai could explain his reasoning. Another hour later Sai looked back to her to confirm his suspicions that Naruto was refusing to stop because he had not allowed him to fight. Though he could not see her wry smile, he could see the amusement in her eyes and shook his head, turning back to their course. After a few more moments Naruto began to slow. Ahead of them there were some weather-stained ruins that would provide cover for their camp that even in his ill humor he could not forego. Pausing to allow their senses to survey the area, they could see no sign of any living creatures. It spoke of how the enemy was polluting the area around Rivendell, that despite it being a little after dawn there was no birdsong, nothing emerging from a burrow to eat and drink the dew. It was as silent as they had ever heard a place, and Sakura found it unnerving. The three of them dropped from the trees and slowly circled around to view their stopping place, and reassure themselves that it was deserted. The ruins were little more than a low wall and the remains of a crumbled tower that the ground had not yet reclaimed. However, it was more shelter from the cold wind than there was likely to be within a few miles, so they unrolled their beds near the tower. Against the wall Sai gathered some undergrowth and a few twigs together to create a fire. As they were choosing to sleep through the day and travel at night, a fire was less likely to reveal their position. Sai had helped Sakura work through the Uchiha archives when the compound had been cleared to provide more housing space and had been taken with the way the Uchihas had wielded fire. Naruto was an expert at creating and controlling large firebursts. Either Sakura nor Sai had chosen to comment on how similar these were to Sasuke's. Sakura could create fire easily but lacked the chakra reserves to use it on the same scale as her friend. Fire did not really play to Sai's skills, but his technical ability with chakra was unrivaled, and he was particularly adept at producing the small, smokeless fire he was currently bringing to life so they could heat some food and water. Sakura unpacked their rations and unhooked the water tin from Naruto's pack. She threw it to him and pointed down to their left where they could distantly hear running water. Nodding, he stalked off, although the tight set of his shoulders was starting to loosen. With the fire burning without the need of his attention, Sai took over the dinner preparations, as Naruto had not been merely attempting to make their hosts laugh with his remark about Sakura's cooking ability. When Naruto returned, they made a swift and easy stew from the dried items the elves had prepared for them. Food always calmed Naruto, even if it was not Ichiraku ramen, and he pushed his mask to the side of his head so he could see Sai more clearly. So why did we leave those orcs alive? He asked. Sakura tapped the implement she had been told was a spoon against her lips. The fellowship will follow this route, shouldn't we have helped clear their path? She wondered. Those orcs do not see the carrier of the ring to be a threat. They would travel in larger groups and not rely on a single scout to inform them of danger. There is clearly some level of communication as they are spread out around Rivendell to provide better chances of catching Frodo. Therefore, if we were to destroy a camp, the others would realize that there was more danger than they previously thought, Sai answered. Then they would start taking it more seriously, mused Naruto, starting to see the sense of Sai's actions. Then it would make it harder for the fellowship when they pass by, finished Sakura, nodding along with their explanations. Sai swallowed a mouthful before continuing. The less prepared the enemy is, the better their chance of making the journey. Those orcs would have posed no threat to us, but in greater numbers and more wary they could have been worse for a group with 4 members with no fighting experience. Also, if what Gandalf said about Saruman having dominion over creatures such as birds, the information may also reach him before we do. Naruto rubbed the back of his hair, looking sheepishly at his friend. I'm sorry, Sai. I didn't think about it like that. That's alright, Naruto. You're still thinking that everyone has the same skills we do, like we're still in Konoha, said Sai, smiling slightly. I keep doing it too, Naruto. We wouldn't have trouble, so why should they? Grinned Sakura, reaching over to punch Naruto lightly in the arm. Naruto smiled, rubbing his arm where Sakura's fist had landed. Sai seemed quietly relieved that the group dynamic had returned to normal. The 3 of them had been friends for so long that he recognized it was irrational to worry simply because they were having a disagreement, but he still felt anxious during these times. Sakura rolled her eyes at him fondly as she saw these thought processes crossing his face and told Naruto to get some sleep. Sai always took first watch as it took him the longest to fall asleep and preferred to know all was definitely quiet before he slept himself. Sakura's was the more difficult middle watch as she was far more used to awakening and returning to sleep after a task due to her work at the hospital where she was often summoned in the middle of the night. Naruto found it easy to sleep with his 2 friends close by and often needed the longest stretch of unbroken sleep, or he became irritable, so the final watch was best for him. As Naruto and Sakura settled close to each other, and the fire, Sai leaned back against the stones and watched the Middle-earth morning develop. XXXXX. The fellowship had been traveling for 2 days when they came across an abandoned Orcish camp in a clearing near a river. Thankfully, the creatures that had made it appeared to have moved on, but they had left their mark in the damaged undergrowth and scored trees. As the others walked past once Aragorn had declared that they were safe, Legolas frowned as he ran a hand along the ruined bark. He tipped his face up to express his sympathy to the tree. Though these woods had long turned silent to his kind, his keen elf eyes caught sight of something in the higher branches. The moss coating had been disturbed recently, within days. Stretching to look closer, he could see it was in the shape of footprints, as if someone had been crouched in the tree for a time. He smiled to himself, glad to see that the ninjas were heading in the proper direction, when a commotion arose from the direction the fellowship had gone. Pulling himself into the trees, he could see that the ninjas had moved straight past, still heading south. He changed course slightly, veering to the right to work out the cause of distress without revealing his presence. His first thought was that perhaps the orcs that had made the camp had not moved as far as they had hoped. However, as he caught up to his comrades, he could see that it was a wolf pack. At first his blood ran cold. They were larger than most, and his initial thought had been that they'd stumbled over the warg pack that the scouts had spoken of. However, a warg pack would have already fallen upon the fellowship, as their insatiable hunger, and the maddened, inbred hatred of other living creatures would have compelled them. The eyes of the wolves were alight with an unnatural glow as they were prey to the whims of their enemy, but they seemed hesitant to engage the fellowship. Boromir and Aragorn formed a bulwark that the wolves would have to overcome to reach the others, as Gimli and Gandalf stood with their weapons drawn, corralling the hobbits into the center of the group. The hobbits had also surrounded Frodo in a protective circle and had drawn their own swords, which were little more than daggers when compared to those of the others. The wolves snarled and snapped, pacing in front of the 2 men who brandished their swords and stood firm. If these were wargs, then 1 or 2 would have already broken from the group in an attempt to circle and attack from behind. As it was, one wolf was retreating slightly, and Legolas shrugged off his bow and fixed it in his sights should it attempt that maneuver. The leader was the one to watch, as its actions would determine those of the rest of the pack. It was a large male, and from its coloring the father of at least 2 of the other wolves that made up the group. The unrelated animals had been most likely drawn to this familial pack under the will of either Sauron or Saruman, as there was little cohesiveness in the way they moved with the others. As far as those with experience of these animals could see, the main danger was that these creatures were clearly starving. The shadow of evil that followed the servants of the Dark Lord had scared away all their food sources in the area, and their pickings had become very lean. It would be near impossible to scare away a hungry animal when it was confronted with a food source, especially one as appetizing as Bill the pony. Bill formed the final side of the square that surrounded Frodo, but was pawing the ground fitfully, and if he chose to bolt he would surely drag poor Sam along for the ride as his bridle was clutched in the hobbit's free hand. Legolas saw the moment the lead wolf decided the risk was worth the price of a meal, and let his arrow fly to take out the wolf that would have used the distraction to attack from behind. The Fellowship watched its body fall but could not react as the pack lunged almost as one. Boromir threw his shield in the path of the lead wolf, catching it on the jaw and knocking it off its course towards the hobbits. It landed heavily but regained its feet almost immediately, and Boromir was forced to follow it, pointing his sword in the hope of catching it through the heart. Aragorn stood his ground as a large female came snapping at his throat, his blade held sideways between his hands against the creature's neck. Another arrow came singing from Legolas' bow but did not immediately kill the wolf advancing upon the hobbits, as the two men could not check its approach. The shaft was lodged in its upper shoulder and Gandalf advanced, confident that its injury would slow it down. Gimli moved more firmly in front of the hobbits as he recognized, in his own head at least, that Legolas had their rear covered from the trees. The lead wolf jumped at Boromir, and he suddenly lost his footing on the damp ground. The cry of dismay from the hobbits drew Legolas' attention from them to the Gondorian. Boromir hit the ground hard and his sword arm jarred painfully where the elbow had hit the ground. Years of experience kept his hand grasped on the hilt, but his arm was sluggish, and would not respond. He had pulled the shield to protect his chest, so the wolf clamped its jaws around his exposed arm. It had powerful jaws but could not pierce his skin as his vambraces withstood the crushing force. He struggled against the ground but could find no purchase to heave himself up or away from the animal. He heard a yelp that came from over by the pack as Legolas prevented the others from getting close to Boromir. Suddenly a huge weight descended on his chest, pinning his shield arm. Aragorn had flung the carcass of the wolf he had managed to slay into the body of the leader, distracting it enough to release Boromir's arm. As Boromir heaved the body off and scrabbled backwards to regain his feet, Aragorn focused on the leader. Behind him he heard the hobbits gasp, and there was the thick thudding noise of a heavy battle-axe being buried in flesh. Gimli was muttering to himself as he pressed his foot into the body of his kill to leverage his axe free. Gandalf had slain the wolf Legolas had injured, so the leader posed the real danger. Having been unable to finish off its prey, it was more wary of Aragorn and afforded Boromir the time to stand at Aragorn's shoulder, putting himself once again firmly between the hobbits and any danger. Risking taking his eyes from the wolf, Aragorn looked to his fellow. Boromir felt Aragorn's eyes on him but did not move his gaze, merely inclining his head to show he would follow Aragorn's lead in this matter. Heartened, Aragorn gained a better grip on his sword and began sidestepping in the hope that he and Boromir would be able to encircle the beast. Legolas readied an arrow but from his position was unable to be sure of an unobstructed shot, and could not risk hitting either man. The wolf was strong but the lack of food had weakened it, and its thought processes were slowed. So intent was it on Aragorn that it failed to see Boromir approaching from behind with his sword drawn. He lunged forward, pushing the blade into the animal's side as Aragorn took advantage of its distraction to run his sword along its throat. With the leader slain the last two wolves, two of those not of the leader's pack seemed to be able to shake the spell of their enemy and fled. A silence descended over the Fellowship as they took stock of the first real test they had faced on this journey. Boromir and Aragorn nodded to each other as they sheathed their weapons, and Boromir swung his shield back over his shoulder. There was still tension between the two, but there was a sense it had lessened as both were prepared to fight together. The hobbits were breathing heavily, both terrified and exhilarated. Frodo was clutching his shoulder, his eyes closed in relief, while Sam fussed over Bill. Legolas descended from the trees as gracefully as if he had merely stepped down. Gandalf read on his face that he was planning to make a snide remark to Gimli, and gave him a warning glance. Gimli was also given such a look and conceded that now was not the time to damage the positive atmosphere that had developed on their victory. On seeing that all was well and Boromir's arm did not appear to be damaged beyond some heavy bruising under the vambrace, Gandalf motioned that they should continue before the noise of battle drew any undesirable attention their way. Fueled by adrenaline, their pace was swift, and before nightfall they were able to reach some ruins that Aragorn had spoken of that may have sheltered them from the elements, better than most. Gandalf denied the hobbits a fire, still concerned that their presence may have been marked, so instead the Fellowship settled down for the night. Sam, Merry and Pippin fell asleep almost immediately. They were unused to the harsh traveling speed that Gandalf demanded, and tired easily. Legolas and Gimli settled themselves at opposite ends of the camp in a show of restraint. A mutual accord not to incite any trouble at present seemed to have developed between them, though it was unspoken. Aragorn and Boromir had laid their packs close to each other, relying on each other to wake and alert them if there was danger. As the Fellowship began to fall into slumber, only Gandalf and Frodo remained awake. The moon was full and illuminated their camp enough that it was a simple matter for Frodo to pick his way around the others to sit at Gandalf's side. The wizard smoked calmly, utilizing his skill to prevent the smoke rising into the air and revealing them. Frodo's face was pale and lined with the stress of unnecessary hardship and pain at the wound that had not yet healed. It was not a fate that Gandalf would have chosen for him, but he had long ago recognized that at times things that happened were simply meant to happen. After a few moments Frodo spoke. "That was not the worst we will come across, was it, Gandalf?" Gandalf drew a lungful of smoke as he considered his answer. Frodo was a bright hobbit, far too like his uncle, and would likely catch any attempt at blind reassurance. He carried the ring now. He had to know what the task entailed. "No, Frodo. That was not the worst. In fact, I would say that it was perhaps the least of the danger this fellowship will face, he replied, choosing to stress the unity of the fellowship to prevent Frodo thinking that he would have to face anything alone if it could be helped. Frodo nodded, the grave expression on his face revealing that he had evidently expected such an answer. Already the burden of the ring was starting to distance Frodo from his fellows. The other hobbits had been overjoyed that they had defeated the wolf pack and were already talking of what they would do once the ring had been destroyed. The confidence they held in the fellowship was a light that Gandalf could not bear to see extinguished, but the wolves had been merely the first taste of the dangers that lay ahead. Frodo evidently recognized that, and for Gandalf that was the true sadness of the matter. Do you think Naruto, Sai and Sakura fare well, Gandalf? Frodo asked, looking up at the wizard. Gandalf smiled down at him. I should think so, he replied. Look there, on the bricks above Legolas. Frodo squinted over to where the elf lay, his eyes open in the manner of his race as they slept. The moonlight poured from behind a cloud and revealed to him some strange characters etched into the stone. They were not runes as Dwarvish was, nor was it the sweeping, beautiful text of the elves. Instead it seemed to be almost a halfway point between the two. Frodo had never seen a script like it before. What does it say, Gandalf? I do not know, my boy. It is definitely their script, but I could not tell you what it means. Then why did they leave it? Frodo asked, frowning over at the script. It was a short message, but clearly seen. You must remember, Frodo, the enemy cannot read it either. Gandalf paused to allow Frodo to think on the issue. After a moment the answer came to Frodo. It is a sign that they have passed this way? Indeed, Frodo. They cannot communicate with us for fear of drawing our enemies down on either themselves or this fellowship. However, as the enemy will not recognize their writing, they felt it safe to leave a message for us. The words are unimportant. It merely shows that they are well. Frodo stared out into the darkened woods that lay ahead. Do you think they'll succeed, Gandalf? Gandalf huffed on his pipe. You have quite enough troubles, young hobbit, to start carrying the burdens of others as well. Frodo nodded at the wisdom in these words, though he knew he would not be able to stop fretting over their absent comrades. As he settled in his bedroll he glanced at the message they had left, and resolved to ask them what it said when they met again. The ninjas had been traveling for just over a week when they came to the Gap of Rohan. Their journey had been swift and relatively untroubled by the forces that threatened the fellowship. They kept to the sparse trees, meaning they often simply ran over the heads of the occasional orc scouting party they passed. Aragorn had marked the road that linked the old kingdom of Arna with that of Gondor, and it was this they had been following for the past 3 days. Since 2 days previous they had been able to see a break in the great mountain range that had been an ever-present feature to their left. Gandalf had told them that they would be able to hear the great river Isen within a day's travel of Isengard, but so far there had only been more unnatural silence. It was close to dawn, and the sky was turning from midnight blue to purple and gold as the sun began to rise. They were searching for a suitable place to camp, but as they were so close to the enemy they were resigning themselves to another night spent in the trees. Sakura risked climbing higher into the branches to survey the wider landscape. According to their map they would soon pass through the gap itself and come across the fords of Isen. Due north of the fords was Isengard with its master residing in the central tower of Orthanc. She could not see the ford from her present location, but something strange directly south of the path they traversed caught her eye. Reaching into the pouch at her side she withdrew a pair of small binoculars. Across the road they were to the side of there appeared to the bank to a large river. She whistled a bird call to alert her companions. They had tailored their traditional call of various insects to the birds that inhabited Rivendell in the hope of blending in, further to the countryside. They had been informed that insects such as screeching cicadas, a favorite of Naruto, did not exist in this more northerly climate, and would draw more suspicion. Naruto and Sai appeared at her sides in an instant, and she pointed to where they should focus, passing her binoculars to Naruto as Sai drew his own. Naruto had a habit of misplacing his pair, and if he borrowed hers she would not allow him to leave them lying around. Once they had seen what she had they dropped back below the cover of the branches. Is that the Isen? Asked Sakura, prompting Sai to pull out their map. He tapped the map at the collection of strange trees they had passed but a few hours previously. Aragorn really had marked every salient feature he could remember to ease their journey, it seems so. I thought Gandalf said it was a large river? Asked Naruto, motioning to his ear to remind them they should be able to hear the running of water. It's supposed to be. Should we investigate? Asked Sai. We can go over to the trees on the other side of it to make camp for the day, said Naruto, sounding as confident as a leader, but pulling the end of the sentence up slightly to make sure his companions agreed. Nodding at him they scanned the area for enemies before silently landing on the ground and moving swiftly towards the riverbank. It had rained recently as the ground was relatively damp underfoot, but the river itself had been reduced to a trickle. It moved sluggishly several feet lower than it was obviously intended as the banks sloped sharply towards the bottom. The rocks that lay now on the silt had been smoothed and rounded by years of fast-flowing water, and the plants that had grown along the sides were drooped and withered. It was obvious that it had been dry for some time. It must have dried up recently, since the last time Aragorn and Gandalf were here, mused Sakura. Naruto clambered down into the riverbed, and up the opposite bank to look for suitable trees in which to make camp. Sai and Sakura followed as the sun was rising and they would soon be exposed in the light. The trees here were gnarled and more unfriendly than those they had experienced near Rivendell, but they often provided excellent shelter in amongst their boughs. Once they had settled themselves, Naruto gestured back towards the river. A dam? He asked. Must be, Saruman? Added Sakura. I doubt anyone else in this area would be able to do something as drastic as damming a river without at least his support. Is he doing it for a purpose or merely to deprive the lands of a steady water supply? Asked Sai. Wouldn't put it past him, Naruto said with a frown, but I bet he's up to something worse. Could he be making power from it? Sakura nodded, looking grimly at the river. Do they have hydropower here? If so, then he could be doing anything with it. I don't believe it is hydropower, as we would understand it. He will be using it to run water wheels. But yes, with a river this size, that is a lot of power he could be generating, meaning a large operation, said Sai. We'll just have to shut whatever it is down after we've dealt with him, stated Naruto firmly. Sakura and Sai nodded. They could not allow any sort of operation that may endanger the fellowship to continue. They just hoped that it would not make their mission more difficult. They would be able to reach Isengard within the next night, and start their preparations for the assassination. XXXXX. The next evening Naruto was forced to come to a dead halt as the trees they were currently traveling through thinned completely. They had passed through the gap and were now cautiously moving north deep into the heart of Saruman's lands. There were far more orc patrols here, so their rate of travel had slowed considerably. Their hands were tied when it came to their enemies. As if they caused any trouble within these borders, they would be overcome. Naruto clearly hated having to avoid the fights, but he recognized the delicacy of their current situation. He could likely cut a clean swathe through to Orthanc all on his own, but Saruman would escape in the confusion, and that was something they simply could not risk. Sakura and Sai, through years of long training, were able to stop themselves from colliding with him. Looking around his shoulder, Sakura was forced to suppress a gasp at the devastation they saw laying out in front of them. The tree line ended so abruptly that Naruto was almost visible from the ground. The stumps of the downed woods littered the earth as far as they could see around the suddenly visible and imposing tower of Orthanc. The ground was scored, torn and burned so as to be almost unrecognizable as the same land as that which they were standing on. From their position they could see the light coming from small fires surrounding the tower with many orcs sitting around them. There was even more firelight shining up from the under the ground through the great cutaways into the earth. It brightened up the night sky considerably, and the three of them could see almost clearly as their eyes had adjusted to the weak starlight that constantly filled the sky. Naruto breathed out heavily and shared a slightly wild look with Sakura while Sai used the light to begin cataloging their best approach. Sakura smiled at him though he could not see it. Sai was sensitive to nature but was an expert at focusing on the task ahead of them to prevent his feelings leaking to the surface. They would have to circle the compound several times to gain a good feel for the number of orcs and other creatures, as well as the best entrances and exits. Retreating slightly from the tree line, Sai took out their map once again. They could not risk speaking for fear of alerting any nearby patrols, so he angled it into the light, and ran his finger along the river that they had been keeping close to. He pointed to where they could see the deep crevice running around near the compound that should have been full of water. Sakura focused her binoculars on it, and followed around to a point where she could see small lights moving along the top of a high construct. Though it was too dark to see exactly what was there, she would bet it was the dam that was stopping the water. Naruto and Sai agreed when she passed them the binoculars. Sai clenched his hand into a fist, their sign for if Sakura should use her strength. Naruto nodded excitedly. Sakura tilted her head to make him continue. Using her talents was risky as they would attract so much attention. Sai pointed to the tower, to show that they would take care of Saruman first, then to the dam, then to the holes leading to the underground activities. Sakura nodded, clenching her fist and knocking it against Naruto's then Sai's. They spent the remainder of the evening sleeping in the trees away from the beaten paths as they would need the daylight to make accurate observations. They would have several days before the fellowship arrived, and they were confident that even if they were late their companions would wait at a safe distance for a while. The day was spent observing the comings and goings around the compound. There seemed to be a small service entrance that was their initial choice for sneaking inside, but it seemed to be constantly in use. After circling twice, Sai gathered them to point to a small balcony high on the wall of the tower. It was high enough to suggest that it was relatively high-class accommodation. Elrond's quarters had been on the most elevated level of Rivendell, and Boromir had mentioned that his quarters had been at the very top of Minas Tirith. If these led to Saruman's quarters, it would be too good an opportunity to let pass. Once this discovery had been made, they ensured that one of them was focused on it at all times in the hope that they could confirm it did indeed belong to Saruman. That left the others with attempting to see a pattern in the guard patrols and if there were any dangers they so far had not been aware of. Naruto was on duty watching the balcony when a figure, old and robed in white, appeared briefly. He leant on the stone railing and surveyed the area before returning the rooms beyond. Naruto had kept a close view of him during this time but had been sure not to look at the wizard's face in case he made eye contact. Gandalf had not been as specific as they would have liked regarding how the wizard cast his spells, but if they were similar to genjutsu then he could not risk falling prey to Saruman's power. That night he reported the news that he was sure the balcony belonged to their target. This left them with planning how to scale the building without being seen, as well as how to navigate once they were inside. For the second problem, Sakura proposed an idea. She and Naruto had tested that their animal contracts still worked in Middle-earth while they were still in Rivendell, even if it did tire their summons. If they could get one of their contracted creatures up to the balcony, then it could report on what it found. Unfortunately, neither frogs nor slugs were particularly suited to this task, as the frogs would suffer in the dry atmosphere and the slugs moved so slowly. They debated the matter for some time, but nothing came of it except that it inspired Sai to think of the solution. In a similar manner to his interest in the Uchiha's jutsus, he had also been fascinated with Iwa no Deidara, who his team had come face to face with on several occasions. Team 7 had ascribed this to the fact the Akatsuki member had used his art as a fighting style, as did Sai. Therefore they had not thought much of the matter, and had endeavored to remember all the details they could to help satiate his desire for knowledge of the bomber. Although Deidara's fighting style was essentially useless to anyone who did not possess his bloodline limit, Sai had managed to adapt a jutsu for scouting from him. Deidara had often used his clay birds to listen for information and then report it back to him in the same manner that a clone dispensed all its knowledge back to its creator, once it was destroyed through a mental link. Through trial and error, Sai had managed to create a live drawing that was capable of this. Naruto and Sakura agreed that this was a much superior plan and decided to wait for nightfall to put it into action. Once it became dark enough, Sai opened one of his scrolls and selected a brush from his traveling pack. Again thankful for the light that Saruman's industries were producing, he created a bird, similar to the natives of Middle-earth, with a few quick strokes. Naruto and Sakura moved to shield him from the tower with their bodies as he ran through a complicated series of hand signals, and small flash of blue light brought the bird to life. It stood completely still as Sai whispered its orders to it, ignoring Naruto's interest as he touched it gently, and came away with ink on his finger. Once Sai had finished his commands and nodded, stretched its frail wings and flew out from the trees, the ninjas watched with bated breath as it skillfully clung to the shadows as it crossed the land and reached the base of the tower. Even with their binoculars it disappeared from sight as it circled upwards towards the balcony, and they would be forced to wait until it returned to locate it again. Neither Naruto nor Sakura had never been particularly patient, so distracted themselves with coming up with ideas on how they would cross the same distance undetected, while Sai concentrated on maintaining the jutsu. It was not powerful or draining, but it was complicated, and they may not have another chance to seek this information, so it was best to make sure it worked the first time. Even with the cover of night and their voluminous cloaks, it would be a lengthy sprint, and it would only take one orc to raise the alarm. Naruto was all for simply taking it at a rush and hoping, but Sakura was not sure even Naruto's legendary luck would hold for such a risk. They had an advantage in that so close to their master the orcs clearly felt safe, as few would risk attacking them while they lingered in Saruman's shadow. Aside from a few scouts, most were more concerned with the internal politics and hard work of their society. There was every chance they could use the inattention of their foes to their advantage. The two of them lapsed into silence as they both started considering their options. Anything they came up with would have to be run past Sai, as tactical decisions were his area of expertise, but they often had flashes of inspiration that defied Sai's more by the book approach. Naruto was thinking of some sort of distraction. Perhaps they could create clones in the form of elves and draw away some attention that would otherwise be focused on the tower. Sakura was considering a mass jinjutsu. A simple sleeping jutsu could easily cover their approach, and it would seem to the orcs that they had simply nodded off and thus have nothing to report to their master. As Sai was still looking unfocused into the middle distance, Naruto and Sakura began sharing their ideas in a whisper. Naruto was excited by Sakura's idea. It was not as flashy as his approach, but it was more streamlined, and with fewer parts there was less chance of something failing. With the sun starting to rise, they decided to settle and sleep again in case they had to make a move the next night. The moon was starting to fill again, and if they did not make a move soon, the light from it could make their progress more difficult. In the morning they were startled awake by Sai suddenly flinching from his doze as his bird landed on his lap. The bird melted away back into the scroll that Sai unrolled for it, and the information transferred to him with a start. They checked the area around them for any unwanted listeners before Naruto and Sakura crowded their companion so he could relay what he'd found. The balcony leads to a small chamber. It looks like a study with other doors that probably lead to bedrooms or something. There's a large door that leads to a central chamber with a throne. Naruto and Sakura snorted softly in derision. Sai smiled and continued, "This is the main room, but the bird saw that Saruman spends most of his time in the study, and the servants are only allowed as far as the throne room." "Sounds perfect. Could we catch him sleeping?" asked Naruto. "He does not sleep much. He seems to spend most of his time with a strange orb that sits in the middle of his study. Should we try tonight?" "Sakura has an idea of how we can cross over to the tower," said Naruto, almost vibrating with excitement at the prospect of finally seeing some action. Sakura nodded, although she suspected Sai would wish to wait longer to make sure they had thoroughly considered all variables. "A blanket sleeping just would take care of all those in our path, and so long as we climb the tower quickly it should give us enough time to get inside. The tower is white, we will be very obvious as we climb," stated Sai, not so much picking at her plan but rather attempting to smooth their path. Sakura nodded. "If we cast a weak transformation jutsu to lighten our cloaks once we reach the tower, we can hopefully be less obvious. Ideally, no one will see us at all if I can cast a strong enough genjutsu. We can't see any wargs, so hopefully no one will feel us molding our chakra. I think this is the best shot we'll get. We don't have as much time as you'd like, Sai," said Naruto, clapping a hand on Sai's shoulder. Sai did not immediately reply, instead casting his eyes over the expanse that stood between them and their target. Naruto was right. The Fellowship was approaching and they could not allow them to be too close to Saruman. It was too dangerous. Turning, he nodded to Night. XXXXX. The day passed swiftly as they made their preparations for their mission. They travel in the depths of night to shield their passing and with luck catch Saruman sleeping, though this was unlikely. They tied their packs up in the trees to conceal them and free themselves from any unnecessary weight. The lighter they traveled, the quieter they would be, and there would be nothing to impinge them in a fight should it come to that. Finally, Sai decided that the light was low enough for them to put their plan into action. They had already had a stroke of luck in that clouds had been rolling in through the day, and were covering most of the light from the moon and stars. Naruto had been correct again that this was to be their best chance. Mentally drawing a path around the Orthanc campfires to the tower, they ghosted silently from the trees, and Sakura's hands flew through the science to create a simplistic sleeping jutsu. Rather than feathers or petals as she usually used, she took advantage of the ash that filled the air as it rose from whatever Saruman was working on below ground. There was barely a twinkle in the sky as ash seemed to rain down over the orcs around the tower. Most barely looked up, as Sakura had correctly predicted. They were used to it. This meant that they did not attempt to avoid staring at the particles that carried the genjutsu. The ninjas moved forward carefully as the orcs began to fall asleep without alarm. Once they were sure the genjutsu had taken hold, they broke into a silent sprint to reach the base of the tower, barely breathing for fear of the sleeping orcs stirring. They had seen no animals that may have been more attuned to their chakra signals, but still used the barest minimum to blend their cloaks to the color of the wall they would be climbing. With one last scout of their surroundings, they nodded to each other. Sakura went first. Her superior chakra control gave her a feel for the stone, and helped the others regulate how much chakra they would need to use. She also had the advantage if they needed to break open the door at the top, as she could rip it from its hinges if they needed to enter quickly. Naruto followed, forcing himself not to overtake his friend on the ascent, and Sai once again covered the rear. This was not the controlled and composed climb that Sakura had demonstrated for the Fellowship and their elven hosts. They clung the walls with their hands and feet and scrambled upwards like spiders. The climb seemed to take hours, and when a sharp bird cry broke through the air, they froze, pressing themselves against the stone. After a few frantic heartbeats, the alarm was not raised. The cries receded and they restarted their ascent. When they reached the bottom of the balcony, Sakura raised her head slowly over the stone to ensure the door was closed before they pulled themselves onto it. She gestured that thankfully it was, and they all slid over the top of the banister and flattened themselves against the stone floor. There was no way to view them from above except for birds, and from the ground they could not be seen. They allowed themselves a moment to compose themselves and prepare for the next phase of the mission. They allowed their senses to flow beyond the relatively simple doorway to Saruman's study. There was a strange burning and roiling sensation near the powerful source that seemed very familiar to Gandalf's. Sai gestured to his companions, forming a sphere with his hands, the orb that his bird had related to him. Naruto pointed to the handle and Sakura nodded. The others pressed themselves to the walls on either side as Sakura twisted the handle as silently as she could manage. Saruman had not locked the door, evidently feeling confident that no one could reach him through it at this height. The light from inside was bright, almost like flames, as it flowed around the tall, thin figure of Saruman, facing away from the door. Sakura slid inside. Naruto followed, and then Sai, who drew the door shut silently behind him to avoid anything down below seeing the light pouring from their master's doorway. Saruman was still engrossed in the glowing orb in front of him, his hand hovering over it as he appeared to be listening to something. If they strained their hearing, they could hear a dark speech similar to the one the orcs used, and a claustrophobic feeling that made their skin crawl like the effect of the ring. While Naruto stood directly behind Saruman, it was Sai that drew a kunai to strike the white wizard down. The whispering suddenly rose to a crescendo and Saruman spun around, the shock of coming face to face with three masked figures written all over his face. The moment stretched as the light from the orb extinguished itself, reducing the light in the room to a more comfortable level for the ninja, the fire crackling in the corner, and the many candles providing the only illumination. Saruman was in the body of an old man, appearing to have years over even Gandalf. His white hair flowed over his shoulders and his bushy eyebrows bristled over dark eyes that held a spark of madness. His chest rose and fell harshly as he grasped the staff tightly in his right hand. Once he realized that he had not been struck down, immediately his expression relaxed, and he raised his left arm in a magnanimous gesture. "What brings you to my home, friends, from so distant a land?" he asked, recognizing them ninjas, surely the descendants of those he had once met on his travels decades before. The words flowed over them, warm and soothing, almost like a physical presence. Naruto's stance relaxed slightly. For some reason his head was becoming fuzzy, and he could not remember why he had thought Saruman was such a threat. Standing here he was merely a kindly old man, and the longer he stood near him the less he could remember about his purpose. Turning his suddenly heavy head to the right, he could Sai was in a similar predicament, the kunai in his right hand starting to slip from his grasp. Sai could not remember the last time he felt so at peace. Perhaps it had been when he had been back in Konoha, before Sakura had started acting so strangely. He had not realized how strongly the ring and the task of keeping his companions safe in an unfamiliar land had been affecting him. His limbs felt leaden, and he had the vague sensation of his hand failing to grasp something that was inside it. Saruman's kindly smile slowly morphed into a wicked smirk as he watched his spell taking effect. He reached a hand into his voluminous robe and drew a cruel knife from a sheath. He had taken a step towards Naruto when, "Release!" A small hand in leather gloves grasped his wrist with crushing force, and he was swung into the wall hard enough that he heard his head crack against the stone and he dropped into a daze. Naruto and Sai suddenly shook from their stupor, Sai regaining his grip on the kunai that had almost fallen to the floor. Between them and Saruman stood a furious Sakura, protecting them like a lioness with her 2 fingers extended still in the motion to release the wizard's genjutsu. Saruman lay at the base of the wall, surrounded by parchment that he had brought off the table with him as he slid to the floor. His suddenly frail appearance belied his powerful sorcery that had almost been the end of them. Saruman stirred to the sight of the 3 ninjas standing over him, poised to strike as if he were a dangerous snake. He had always been able to ensnare the minds of mortals. It was as if they had been warned. Gandalf. They saw the blind fury cross his face as he realized that his sparing of Gandalf had led to the situation he found himself in. He pushed himself back against the wall to roar to his subordinates, but was silenced forever with a kunai to the heart. Sakura pressed 2 fingers to the wizard's neck to check his pulse before Sai withdrew his blade. Naruto dropped his head in respect for a fallen enemy, still uncomfortable with the ruthless nature of their job even after all this time. Once she was convinced Saruman had indeed passed to wherever it was that souls departed to in this realm, she nodded to her companion. Drawing a cloth, Sai wiped his stained kunai clean before returning it to his pouch. Sakura looked around the room, moving to reach down a cloak from the wall. Naruto reached forward and closed the wizard's eyes. Sai reached for a side of the cloak and with Sakura, spread it over Saruman's body, covering the deep red stain spreading sluggishly over the white fabric. XXXXX. Miles from the gap, at the Fellowship's campsite, Gandalf awoke with a cry that startled the entire Fellowship into wakefulness. "What ails you, Gandalf?" cried Aragorn, running to the side of his friend and mentor, as the others looked on. Gandalf's face was grim and they could easily read the pain spread over his features. The deed is done. The 3 ninjas stepped back from Saruman's body and looked around the wizard's study. The walls were covered in parchments, and the tables groaned under the weight of books and scrolls. Sai strode to the door to listen for any commotion that would signal their actions had been discovered. Sakura placed a hand on Naruto's arm to ensure he was coping well enough. He had such a soft heart that he could feel regret for even targets as dangerous and uncompromising as Saruman. Naruto put his large hand over hers and nodded. Satisfied, she turned to Sai. "How long do we have? There's bound to be something useful in her somewhere." Naruto began shuffling through a few papers, but as they could not read the writing they would have to find something with illustrations or simply hope that whatever they brought to Gandalf was worthwhile. "I don't think we should let them raise the alarm," said Sai, having come to a decision as he looked through the keyhole. "We should investigate this room thoroughly in case there is something going on that we've missed. We should destroy the dam now. The water will either drown or scatter those orcs outside, and those that aren't swept away will know something has happened to Saruman," said Sakura, picking up Sai's thought path. Sai nodded. "Then we can return here without fear of being discovered." "Hey, look at this!" Naruto's whisper broke through their conversation. On the thick, good-quality parchment there were several smaller illustrations with a larger one below them. They immediately recognized the drawings as being of the many types of orc they had seen, some thin and wiry, others broader and sturdier. However, the large drawing was of a creature unfamiliar to them. "Is that a troll?" asked Naruto, peering at it as he held it up to the light. "I don't think so. This is all proportionate," Gandalf said. "Trolls have long arms and stubby legs," said Sakura, pressing on his wrist slightly so she could see. Sai pointed to the patch on its face. "Is that a handprint?" "Looks like one." "What are these lines from these 4? asked Naruto, pointing to the thin lines drawn from 4 of the smaller drawings and leading to the larger one. Sakura leaned in closer, something catching her eye. "Look, the big one has the same nose as that one here," she said, pointing. Sai made a small sound of assent that barely carried in the close atmosphere of the study. "It also has the same ears as the one next to it." "So, it's a combination of these other ones?" asked Naruto. "I'm sure Gandalf said something about orcs being created to be like elves. Maybe Saruman was breeding them together, to create a superior species?" wondered Sakura. "That's disgusting." "Are there female orcs?" asked Naruto, his face screwed up with his distaste at the notion. "How do you know the ones we've seen so far aren't female?" asked Sakura, raising an eyebrow beneath her mask. Sai ignored his companions and focused on the large creature. The Fellowship had told them that orcs were harmed by the sunlight and could not compete against more skilled fighters from the races of elves and men. However, as orcs were the most plentiful creature that served the dark, it did make sense to try and eliminate these weaknesses. This new strain of orc stood taller than the rest, taller than most men if it was on the same scale as the illustrations above, with broad shoulders and corded arms. It would be a dangerous foe if Saruman had succeeded. "You two go destroy the dam. If Saruman has been breeding these things, they're probably underground. I'll stay here and secure this area," said Sai firmly. The sooner they acted, the sooner they could return to the Fellowship. Naruto handed the parchment over to Sai, who placed it on the floor to begin a pile of paper they would take to Gandalf. Sakura shook her arms out to release the tension she had built up in them and circulated her chakra a little in preparation. They opened the door just enough to allow them space to slide through and closed it behind them as quietly as they could manage. Sai moved back towards the door to the throne room, consciously avoiding the orb in the center of the room. He was sure it had alerted Saruman to their presence somehow. Though the time had slowed to a crawl inside Saruman's study, in reality only a few minutes had passed and Sakura's genjutsu still held the orcs around the tower in thrall. They slid down the tower wall, expanding a minimum of chakra to slow their descent, and broke into a run as soon as they touched the ground. From this distance the dam was more obvious, and as they approached they began to hear the churning of a tamed river. There were only 3 guards on and around the dam, as Saruman would have thought that he would have known of the siege engines it would have taken to destroy it had the ninjas not been present. To the ninjas it was a strange and quaint world that operated without the knowledge of gunpowder. Once they had realized that there would be no way to create more explosives when they were in Middle-earth, their exploding tags had become extremely valuable. With Sakura's particular talents available to them, they would save their tags as long as they could. The dam was a rough-hewn but strong construction of wood and metal, the main strength coming from the struts that braced the logs across the power of the water. Naruto threw a kunai at the nearest guard as he continued up the side of the bank. Sakura remained at the base of the dam, clinging to the shadows as Naruto dispatched the other 2 orcs. Similarly to their comrades down below, they were not as attentive to their duties as they should have been, and Naruto was able to appear behind the second orc and slit his throat without alerting the final guard. The last orc was walking slowly along the opposite bank and was carrying a torch that illuminated the area around him. Naruto waited until it had turned away from him before alighting on the dam itself and crossing, the water washing up against his feet as he ran. Disappearing into the shadows in the tree line, he remained still until the orc passed him on its return to the dam wall. It had barely passed him when Naruto slid a kunai into its back from behind and caught the torch as it fell from its nerveless hand. He continued to the dam to conceal from any enemies watching that something had happened to their guard, and once he reached the edge waved the torch to give Sakura the signal. Sakura caught a glimpse of Naruto's mask from the top of the dam and set to work. While Naruto had been eliminating the orcs above, she had concentrated on locating points of weakness in the dam's structure, using the flickering light from the torches along its sides. A solid blow to the supporting struts should ensure that the water pressure did the majority of the work. Once she was sure Naruto was clear, she leapt from the shadows, her chakra curling blue around her fist as she slammed it into the wooden beam. The wood shattered under the force of the blow, the metal groaning as it stretched and tore. She turned on the spot and aimed a square kick at the adjacent pillar. She had chosen 2 of the most central struts, and already the dam was starting to bow under the force. The noise had woken the nearest orcs, and she could already hear the swell of alarm as it spread through the camped creatures. She moved swiftly to destroy another, conscious that if it did not give way soon she would be overcome by the assembled creatures. Suddenly by her head a leak sprung and the roaring, groaning noise intensified. Her breath caught, and she forced her chakra to her legs to spring from the path of the water. As she landed in the trees above the dam, Naruto caught her arm and pulled her in close as the ground shook with the force of nature that struggled at its bonds. The murmuring swell from below, which had initially been anger at the disturbance, had become alarm as they realized the danger they faced. They watched as the orcs began to flee, but the water had broken free of the dam, and the tidal wave moved faster than they could. The water swept away all in its path with a ferocity that awed the ninjas as the tree they were in trembled as the current ran past. In the darkness they could see as the structures that Saruman had created around his fortress were destroyed as the lights on them flickered and died as they fell into the water. Their hearts stopped for a brief second as the water reached the tower with enough force to shake the building. Intellectually they knew Sai would be safe even if the tower fell, but it could not remove the brief moment of fear for him. As it reached the tower it also began pouring into the holes cut into the ground. Huge plumes of steam rose along with the screams of those with no escape from the caverns. The buildup of water was so great that the volume needed to fill the caverns barely reduced the level that swirled away into the trees around what had been the banks of the river. After a few moments the cacophonous noise began to die down, and the waters began to level. As the torches and fires had been extinguished, the land had been plunged into near darkness, and the 2 ninjas could only see as far as the light cast by the torch Naruto held. In the aftermath all was quiet, and they could not sense any orcs nearby. They descended from the trees and leapt onto the surface of the water at the base of the dam. The sheer force of the river ensured that there were no straggling orcs, as they had simply been washed away. Climbing the tower again, they opened the door to Saruman's study. As they had predicted, Saruman's servants had realized something must have happened to their master. Sai reappeared from the door to the throne room, his katana coated with the dark black blood of the orcs. He relayed that the servants had broken through the door, but all but the leader had fled on seeing the body of the wizard. Was it one of those new breeds? Asked Naruto. Sai shook his head. It was large, but it was not like the picture. He showed them his arm. A jagged slice cut through the underside of his forearm where he'd been forced to raise it to protect his face. It was a well-trained fighter though, and I was careless. They're gone though? Asked Naruto as Sakura moved forward to tend to Sai's injury. For now at least, answered Sai. Sakura held his arm gently, and pulled away his torn sleeve. The cut was ugly but not deep, and he had barely lost any blood. Her chakra, green this time, gathered around her hands once again as she scanned the wound for any poisons. She could not feel any corruption, and so began the slow process of reattaching the blood vessels and sealing the skin together. Once she was satisfied his arm would keep until they had more time, she wrapped a bandage around it as Naruto hovered over her shoulder. They then returned to their task of rifling through Saruman's documents in the hope of locating anything that may prove useful to the Fellowship. Under a stone paperweight, Sakura discovered an unrolled scroll that appeared to be a list of some sort. The bottom of it was covered in what looked like spots of blood that had been smeared by thumbprints. They were all different from what she could see, and the blood was definitely more human than orc. being a lighter red rather than black. A list of allies maybe? Asked Naruto, glancing over at it from further down the table. If he has human allies, why would he be creating orcs? Asked Sai. The more allies the better, I suppose. Besides, if these are supposed to be signatures, she gestured to the bloodstains, then it means whoever is listed here can't read or write. Not an ideal comrade. Technically we can't read or write here either, said Sai, smiling slightly at the fondly exasperated look she gave him. What did Boromir say about those people from the south? Hara Hara dash. Asked Naruto. Haradrim. Maybe, but they would be very far north, and would have had to cross Gondor to get here. Wouldn't Boromir's soldiers have dealt with them? Wondered Sai. We'll show it to Gandalf. I suppose it might not mean anything, but we can't risk it, said Sakura. You two found anything? Sai was in the process of shifting a pile of papers that seemed to have designs for siege towers in various stages of completion. Sakura moved to his side and they began to quietly discuss which illustrations would be the most useful. Sighing, Naruto cast an eye over the room. Intelligence gathering of this nature did not run to his skills. His areas of reconnaissance tended to focus on the movements and abilities of living targets rather than those written down. This was especially true when they were in a land where he did not have a hope of understanding any of the text. His comrades, Sakura especially, loved paper documents, and he could only hope that the fact they could not understand them would allow them to leave before the sun rose. Sakura and Sai had spent 3 consecutive days in the underground vaults of the Uchiha compound before a mission had smoked them out. The orb on the table caught his attention. Sai had said Saruman spent a majority of his time with it. Perhaps there was something it could tell them. Looking back, he could see that little would shake Sai and Sakura from their animated discussion regarding which were the most useful scrolls, so he would not be interrupted. Naruto had not been able to hear the ring, but he had definitely heard the whispering coming from the orb and shared Sai's suspicion that it had somehow seen them and warned Saruman. There was nothing coming from it now as he walked around it, viewing it from all angles as he did so. It seemed to be made of fine crystal and there were no visible tool marks marring its surface. There was no color or movement inside it as he could see a distorted view of the room through it. The plinth it rested on was free of any decoration, and he could not see anything that looked like the various forms of writing he had so far seen in Middle-earth. Expanding his senses, he could feel something of a latent thread of energy from deep within the core of the sphere, but nothing overt. He could feel Kyuubi was uneasy. The psychosomatic tightness in his chest told him the great beast was pacing his cage. After the years of dealing with Kyuubi's rages, he was adept at ignoring the feelings of the sealed Ninetales lest he lose control over the seal through second-hand emotion. If Saruman had been using this orb, then it was bound to have more information contained within than what he had consigned to paper. Taking a bracing breath, he placed his hand on the stone. Sakura and Sai felt a huge wave of energy manifest from the center of the room and then die away almost immediately. The force of it was such that all the candles in the room were extinguished, leaving only the firelight from the grate illuminating the room. Spinning around, they were too disorientated to catch Naruto, as he fell unconscious away from the orb in the center of the room. Sakura cried out and ran to him, dropping to her knees to cradle his head. Sai followed immediately, but the orb caught his attention. For the briefest moment he swore he saw a giant eye, wreathed in flame and piercing into his mind. It lingered for less than 1/10 of a second, but Sai recognized it from Frodo's descriptions. They had been seen. He saw a heavy cloth draped over the back of the low chair near Saruman's desk and reached for it, throwing it over the orb to cover it. Once this was done, the room seemed quieter somehow, a sense that something had been removed that they only noticed in its absence. Sai cursed himself for having delayed observing the orb. He should have listened to his immediate instinct and dealt with the danger before allowing Naruto to fall prey to it. He knelt beside his friend and waited anxiously as Sakura attempted to revive him. He could see easily enough that Naruto was merely unconscious, his breaths oddly deep and even as if he were merely sleeping. By contrast, Sakura's breaths were coming in quick and short as she tried to will away the panic he could feel building in her frame. "He won't wake up, Sai," she said, her voice stiltedly calm as it always was when she was under such pressure. "Keep trying, Sakura, he's going to be fine," replied Sai. In truth, he had never fully grasped why people liked to be reassured in such a way, when he could not guarantee that he was correct, but it seemed to calm her slightly. "He's not responding. And the Kyuubi isn't reacting to my chakra like he normally does. What the hell is that thing?" She gritted out from between her clenched teeth as her chakra flowed into Naruto, desperately trying to locate the cause of his slumber. "I saw the eye. The one Frodo says he saw when he touched the ring," said Sai, his voice grim. "What are we going to do?" asked Sakura. "We must leave here, meet with Gandalf. It won't be safe to stay if we have to fight and protect Naruto. I'll gather these documents and collect our bags from the trees. You carry Naruto," Sai stated firmly. Sakura nodded, appreciating, not for the first time, Sai's strategic skills and the confidence she drew from them. "Should we take that thing?" Sai thought for a second. "I don't like the thought of it being with us. What if the same thing should happen to us? But Gandalf might not know what's wrong with Naruto if he doesn't have it. Look, Naruto took his gloves off when he came in. They had blood all over them. He must have touched it with his bare hands," said Sakura. "All right, I'll wrap it in this cloth and carry it in that bag by the fire," nodded Sai, although it was clear from his body language that he was not thoroughly convinced. Sakura stood, flooded her muscles with chakra and heaved Naruto up and over her shoulder. Sai could carry him easier given his height but would tire sooner than Sakura, and they had to move to a safe distance with all haste. Be careful, Sai, she said as she watched her friend gingerly maneuvering the cloth around the orb and into a leather satchel that he'd emptied of the papers it had contained. Once he was sure it was as contained as he could make it, given that he dare not attempt to seal it into a scroll without knowing its capabilities. He collected the papers they had deemed most significant, and packed them around the orb. It was likely that the main doorway would be underwater, so they exited in the same manner as they had entered, the water rippling as they landed on its surface. All was still, and there was no sign of any living creatures in the near vicinity. We'll head to that copse of trees at the gap that Aragorn marked. It should conceal us well enough, and I'll send a clone to the Fellowship with the news, said Sai. Sakura nodded, and the two sped away from the tower, leaving the destruction in their wake. XXXXX. The last watch of the night usually belonged to Sam, as he had taken on the unofficial role of cook and prepared the Fellowship's breakfast as well as their traveling rations for the day ahead. Although he was surrounded by his comrades, he felt unnervingly alone in the still half-light of the morning. The Fellowship slept lightly. The smallest of unfamiliar sounds were enough to rouse the warriors that traveled with them. Sam knew Gimli found the way. Gandalf and Legolas slept with their eyes open to be unnatural, but he found it somewhat reassuring. He did not know how long the oatmeal ration would have to last them, despite Boromir's assurances of its availability in Rohan. But breakfast was the most important meal of the day. This was especially true given the way Frodo had not yet regained the weight he had lost after his injury. He was stoking the fire under the pot when Sai appeared suddenly from the path ahead and moved swiftly to join the company. Sam knocked his ladle against the pan to wake the others as Sai sank into a crouch, his arms braced between his legs. Aragorn, Boromir and Gimli were awake and aware instantaneously with the long practice of warriors whose very lives could depend on such reactions. It was more difficult to tell sleep from wakefulness when it came to Gandalf and Legolas, but they too rose from their bedrolls to congregate by the fire. The hobbits were the last to waken, but soon Sai had the Fellowship alert. Sam had not noticed immediately, but Sai seemed fatigued in a manner he could not remember seeing the ninja before. His posture told of a lengthy journey made in a short period, and Sam could see that this was worrying Gandalf. Sai, what news? Asked Aragorn, pouring a cup of water from his water skin to give to Sai. Sai looked up but refused the water despite the dryness of his throat, as evidenced by his voice when he spoke. This is simply a clone. Sai is ahead at the gnarled trees at the gap of Rohan, those you marked on his map, Aragorn. There has been an incident. Boromir leaned forward, careful not to touch the clone for fear of destroying it. Are they well injured? Must we depart? They are in no immediate danger. The assassination of Saruman was completed, and the dam in the river Isen has been destroyed. However, Naruto has fallen into a deep sleep and Sakura is unable to wake him. They need your skills, Gandalf, said the clone, his voice expressionless as Sai had directed his energy towards creating a clone that could make the journey rather than to pass as himself. The hobbits gasped on hearing the news, and Boromir's face turned ashen at the fate of his friend. What information do you have? Asked Gandalf. There was an orb in Saruman's study. Naruto placed a hand on it, fell unconscious, and they have not been able to revive him since, related the clone. The Palantir! Exclaimed Gandalf. Palantir? Asked Gimli. The ever-practical dwarf was already packing away his sleeping roll in preparation for their departure. The Seeing Stones of the Noldor. I knew Saruman possessed one, but I cannot tell how many remain, or where they might be found, replied Gandalf. I thought such artifacts had been lost? Queried Legolas. I had heard rumors, but until I had seen that of Saruman I too thought they had. This is a serious matter, my friends. If Sauron were to also possess one, there is no telling what he may have learned from Naruto. Do all those who use the Seeing Stones fall into a deep sleep? Asked Aragorn, following Gimli's example. It takes skill to wield such a powerful creation, and if what I fear is true, then Sauron may have overpowered Naruto's mind through it. He could have had no experience with such an object, and could not have known what he was dealing with, said Gandalf. We must make haste to them and hope that we are not too late. XXXXX. The clone had told them that they were but a few hours' travel behind the ninjas and disappeared from existence in a cloud of white smoke. Gandalf pushed the Fellowship as hard as they had traveled since leaving Rivendell. His agitation was contagious, and there was little in the way of chatter, even between Legolas and Gimli, who had been needling each other relentlessly during their waking hours. They could not hope to move as swiftly as the ninja, but Aragorn was confident of reaching their destination before nightfall. His prediction was correct, and the weary Fellowship saw the copse appear as the sun was dipping below the horizon. Sai, the real Sai they supposed, appeared from between the trees as soon as he heard their approach. Sam tied Bill to one of the trunks and followed the Fellowship into the snarl of undergrowth between the twisted trunks. The ninjas had made a clearing in the protective space afforded to them, and in it lay Naruto. Sakura hovered by his side, her shoulders tense and her posture rigid as she kept a vigil over him. Her mask remained in place so they could not read her expression, but her eyes revealed her worry as she fixed them on Gandalf. Boromir was struck by how unnatural the situation was. Naruto was such a colorful, vibrant young man, it was unnerving to see him laying prone on the ground. Sakura had removed his mask and they could see he had not the pale, feverish complexion of one struck down by illness or injury. His skin kept its deep tan, and his dirty blonde hair fell around a face unmarred by stress. It was as Sai's clone had told them. He appeared to be simply in a deep sleep. Gandalf swiftly knelt beside the man, attempting to dismiss the observation that Naruto's youth was only emphasized by his state, and looked to the other ninjas. Do you have the Palantir? He asked. Sai nodded, pointing to the leather satchel that lay at the base of the tree. Aragorn moved towards it, but Gandalf shook his head. Such an item would have to be examined with the utmost care. Can you help him, Gandalf? Asked Sakura. Her voice was strong and firm. I shall do my best, the wizard replied, hoping desperately that it would be enough. Gandalf wasted no time in focusing his energy onto Naruto's prone form. Aragorn knelt next to his old friend, though it was unlikely his field-based medicinal skills would be of use. Sakura tensed at the prospect of allowing another so close to Naruto in his present condition, even if it was someone in whom she had a measure of trust. Sai slipped away from the group to patrol the tree line in case of any unwanted attention. His movements spoke of his agitation, and he often cast his eyes to the sky as if he felt eyes watching him. The hobbits crowded closer, as Gandalf closed his eyes and began whispering softly under his breath. The wizard's old hands rested on Naruto's sternum as he sought the cause of the unnatural sleep. He spoke in a language that Sakura had not heard before, though it seemed that Aragorn and Legolas recognized the lyrical tongue. Boromir and Gimli stood silently at the edge of the group, unwilling to cause any disturbance that might hinder the recovery of their friend. For soldiers, with no knowledge of healing beyond dressing wounds, the time passed slowly. Gandalf frowned and shifted his hands to Naruto's head. He seemed to concentrate, and those around felt a pull as if he was drawing on their energies to revive Naruto. The tension in the air seemed to build, and Sakura tensed. Suddenly Naruto's eyes opened, but they were not the usual deep cerulean, but red with an elongated pupil. His deep breathing changed to a more rapid pace, and Gandalf and Aragorn withdrew, alarmed. An orange film of energy leaked from his skin and surrounded him, and Sakura motioned for the fellowship to step back. The heat of it prickled at their eyes and heated the metal chain that held the ring, causing Frodo to gasp and prise the chain from his skin. He's safe, Sakura stated, her tone firm as she placed herself in Naruto's field of vision. Sai appeared, drawn by the energy swirling around his friend, and stood between the hobbits and Naruto, as if to shield them. Aragorn's hand rested on his sword, a reflex. The force emanating from Naruto was almost as a physical force that seemed to draw the air from their lungs and leave them near gasping for breath. A few seconds after Sakura spoke, the red seemed to bleed from Naruto's eyes and the blue returned. Naruto shook his head slowly and came to. He frowned as he took in the defensive stances of the group and raised his hands, turning over his right hand to see the palm that had touched the Palantir. The skin was unmarked. Naruto, are you all right? Asked Sakura, her voice full of the relief she felt. Yeah. Yes, I think so, he answered, rubbing the back of his head and stretching his uncomfortable muscles. The silence in the copse of trees was oppressive as the fellowship attempted to come to terms with the danger they had seen from their friend and ally. There is something you have not told us, said Aragorn, his face set. Naruto looked up at him in confusion, and then back to Sakura and Sai, who had relaxed their stances and sat either side of him. The hobbits had huddled around the others, their expressions fearful. Legolas and Gandalf appeared shaken, while Boromir and Gimli were again prepared to reserve judgment until the matter had been explained to them. They were already beyond their element when it came to such magics, but they trusted Naruto. We have concealed nothing, Sai answered carefully. That was not Naruto who first awoke, said Gandalf. It was an old evil, powerful and enraged. I could feel it. Naruto sighed, rubbing the palms of his hands into his eyes. He is called Kyuubi or Kurama. Kyuubi? Asked Boromir, the unfamiliar name sliding awkwardly from his tongue. Sai nodded. He is one of the great-tailed beasts, the Nine Tails. He took the shape of a fox, many meters tall, when he was free. A tailed beast? Boromir asked again. They are like spirits? Kurama was as a natural disaster, appearing without warning to cleanse places of dark human excesses, answered Sakura. However, those with the Sharingan could control him, and he was set upon our village by Uchiha Obito. Naruto's mother and father sacrificed themselves to seal him within Naruto. After Obito had freed him, he is imprisoned? Inside Naruto? Asked Legolas in horror. The idea of such a corruption was beyond abhorrent to an elf. The Kyuubi has the power to destroy all that stands in its path. If not for Naruto, we would have all been lost, said Sakura, her tone suggesting restrained umbrage at the elf's reaction. How could your body hope to contain such a force? Asked Gandalf, still shaken at his contact with the Nine Tails. Naruto placed a hand over his stomach and lifted his shirt to reveal the complicated seal around his navel. Around it they could see his tan skin marred with the evidence of a warrior's life. White scars littered the exposed flesh. Many of the fellowship wished for a closer look but held back, fearful of the beast that had awoken instead of their friend. He is my friend now, Naruto answered simply, smiling slightly as Kyuubi scoffed within his mind. While Aragorn, Gandalf and Legolas remained disturbed, Gimli and Boromir could not suppress a smile at the straightforward reasoning that seemed to characterize Naruto. The hobbits were unsure as to how to react. The energy that had emanated from Naruto had been terrifying, but Sakura only had to tell this Kurama that Naruto was safe to make it withdraw. He is your friend now? Was it not always so? Asked Gimli, realizing that the others needed a more positive impression of the creature that dwelled inside their comrade. Naruto laughed aloud, the sound relaxing after the fear that his unnatural sleep had brought the others. No, he had only been free from my mother for a short while before he was closed within me again. He hated humans and hated me as his cage the most. We have reached an understanding over the years and I trust him with my life. He is not sorry for frightening you, that is not in his nature, but he only did so to protect me. Gandalf shook his head, attempting to free himself from the memory of the old and angry beast that he had encountered. Do you remember anything from the Palantir? The Palantir? He asked. The seeing stone, the crystal orb from Saruman's study? Gandalf pressed him for answers, trying to keep the anxiety from his voice for fear of alarming the others. Oh. Only some. He held his head between his hands as he tried to remember. There was a bright light and I could see a tree and then an older man with grey hair standing in a room that overlooked the tree. How did the man appear? Interrupted Boromir, his face suddenly drawn. Naruto lifted his head to look at Boromir. He looked really like you. And the tree? Boromir's voice was resigned. It was white and there were no leaves on it. It had guards standing around it. Naruto chewed his lip as he fought to bring the hazy details to mind. Boromir brought a hand to his face and closed his eyes. The hobbits looked on curiously, as did Legolas and Gimli, while Aragorn and Gandalf shared a pointed glance. What significance has this vision? Asked Gimli, annoyed at the lack of explanation. He saw my father, and the white tree of Gondor that lies in Minas Tirith. What could it mean, Gandalf? Naruto, did you see a man younger than I, more in common with my father than I, perhaps carrying a bow? Boromir asked, his voice showing the repressed emotions as he tried not to fret over his family's safety. Naruto shook his head and the group turned to Gandalf for an explanation. What else did you see? The wizard asked, sinking down onto a fallen branch. I did not see anything beyond that. Kurama broke the connection. He hates any invasion of his space, answered Naruto. I saw the eye, stated Sai quietly. The others drew a sharp breath and Frodo winced as he felt the ring suddenly increase in weight at the mention of its master. Tell me everything, Sai. When Naruto had fallen unconscious we approached him. I looked to the orb and the eye was present. It felt as though it saw right through me. I covered it with a cloth and it was as though the room was empty once again, Sai answered. Gandalf stroked his beard as he pondered the effect the Palantir had caused. It seemed that the spirit that resided in Naruto was powerful enough to prevent Sauron from taking advantage of the young man, and perhaps that meant their secrets were safe. The fact that Sai had been seen meant that the ninja's presence was no longer unknown to the Dark Lord. However, it may be that without Saruman's knowledge Sauron would not understand their significance. Boromir, has your father ever mentioned the Palantir? Asked Gandalf. Not that I recall, but since Mother died he started passing more and more time in his study. His behavior has also become erratic of late, Boromir mused. He did not wish to reveal the depths of his father's rages or bouts of melancholy out of respect, but he was relieved to discuss the matter. I have heard no mention of such an object from any sources during my travels, interjected Aragorn. He did not wish to explicitly state that he had fought alongside Boromir's father many years earlier but knew Gandalf would catch the hidden meaning. Gandalf nodded. Has there been instances where he has anticipated an event before it occurred? Boromir paced silently as he considered the wizard's question. His father had not always been such a secretive man, but in the months before he had left for Rivendell there had been almost no speaking to him. Boromir and the guard had been stretched as thin as they had ever been to protect their lands from the shadow that stretched from Mordor. He had not seen his father in person since the night before he departed, and before then it was his unexpected arrival after their victory at Osgiliath. However, the more he considered events that he had partaken in, the more they became clearer to him. It is true that the men and I have often questioned the more unusual of his orders in the past. At times his commands seemed disjointed, removed from the intelligence that my brother and his rangers had gathered, and directed us to places we thought would have been of no interest to Sauron. In the early days of my captaincy our doubts were always proved false by the appearance of enemy activity. However, more recently the guard has followed his orders and nothing has come of them, and in the worst times we have been stretched too thin to prevent other troubles because of them. Boromir mused aloud. You say that his manner has been deteriorating during this time too? Asked Gandalf gently, aware that this was a sensitive issue. Boromir grimaced. Yes, he has ever been a stern man, but his manner with my brother leaves much to be desired while he finds no fault with me. What say you to this, Gandalf? I fear that Naruto's vision may have been accurate. If your father is in possession of a Palantir it could well explain his behavior. It seems certain now that Sauron has such a seeing stone. Your father has always been possessed of a strong will, and the Palantir served him well for a time. If I was to theorize, I would suspect that Sauron has learned of the connection your father has been exploiting and has turned it against him, explained Gandalf. What shall we do? Gandalf sighed. At present, nothing. We must keep moving to avoid detection. One thing is certain, the ring-bearer cannot go to Minas Tirith. Frodo lowered his head in recognition of this statement. Boromir looked like he desired to protest, but Gandalf's words rang true. His father would stop at little to seize the ring. He had been so insistent that Boromir ensured it was delivered to him, and then it would change him as sure as it had Isildur. The city provides the optimal place to supply ourselves before the last leg of the journey, noted Sai. Indeed, but as Boromir will no doubt tell you, the guards will obey any order given to them by their steward, and it will put Frodo at risk. Even if we were to talk Denethor down from his goal of somehow using the ring, an unlikely endeavor if Sauron has polluted his mind, there are many others within the city who consider it to be a valid course of action. We shall make a decision closer to the time. We should rest tonight and continue our journey into Rohan tomorrow, Gandalf explained. What shall we do with the Palantir? Asked Sakura. I will keep it, pass the bag to me, replied Gandalf, taking the bag from Sai and strapping it to his pack. It would be best if you all forget it is even here. You saw what it did to Naruto. The fellowship agreed and resolved to enjoy the longer evening sleep than they were usually afforded. The revelations they had heard from Naruto, and the knowledge that Sauron may have some reckoning of their actions had left them with much to consider. There was also the task of sorting out their even more confused feelings regarding the ninjas. More than one calculating glance was sent their way as they chattered quietly amongst themselves while preparing to sleep. Their culture was becoming more and more alien the more the fellowship learned of it. It was strange that the idea of old and powerful demonic forces were in some ways more recognizable to those from Middle-earth than the ninjas' cloak and dagger way of life. It was the hobbits that took to these developments easier than their fellows. After leaving the Shire, their learning curve of the world outside had been exponential, and these events were just one more thing among many to be experienced. Legolas and Aragorn, and their rigorous elvish upbringing found their culture more difficult. With the elvish notions of body purity, Legolas found Kurama to be abhorrent, and he knew he would struggle to keep the knowledge from coloring his interactions with Naruto. Sai and Sakura were beyond relieved that Naruto was safe and well, but shared in his unease at having to have shared the existence of Kurama. It was information that the fellowship had not needed to know, either was it ideal that Sauron had learned of him. Although Kurama had severed the connection the Dark Lord had made with Naruto's mind, there was no telling just how much he could have seen. As they ate and slept, there was barely any conversation as the entire fellowship wrestled with their own thoughts. XXXXXX. The passage through the Gap of Rohan had been at once eased and made more difficult by the efforts of the ninjas. The water level had not had time to drain from around the tower, and the Isen ran high over its banks as they headed for the ford. Along the way they passed many orc carcasses, but although the ninjas kept a watchful eye, they did not see the new breed that Saruman may have been working on. They had yet to pass this information along, as Naruto's brush with the Palantir had been a more pressing matter. However, once they could talk to the wizard alone, they would have to give Gandalf the papers they had taken from Saruman's study. Boromir was confident Rohan would remain friendly to them, based on his relationship with the ruling family, but there was no way to tell just how far Saruman's influence had reached. Once they were fully inside Rohan's borders, the land became more open, the dense forests of the other side of the mountain range giving way to rolling plains, except for one forest they could see. Where is that? Sakura asked, as the fellowship rested, pointing to the dark forest. That's Fangorn Forest. It was once a beautiful place, when the Ents were more plentiful, replied Gandalf, looking northwards in the direction she faced. Ents? Asked Sai. He was sure they had not been mentioned in the extensive list of peoples and creatures given to them previously. Merry perked up, excited to have a chance to share his knowledge rather than always having to rely on the others. They're tree herders. They're trees who can move and speak to each other. They protected and cared for the other trees in the forest, but no one's seen or heard of them in years. Folks in the Shire think they're just a story. Gandalf smiled over at the young hobbit. A great many things are just stories to Shirelings, he said in an amused tone. If it wasn't for Uncle Bilbo we might have gone on thinking they were too, laughed Frodo. The others smiled at each other. It was good to see a little levity from the ring-bearer, especially of late. The trees there are very old, and without elves or Ents they've lost their way, become as wild trees, said Legolas, looking wistfully over towards Fangorn. Trees are trees, muttered Gimli, forcing Boromir to drop his face behind his water skein to hide his smile as Legolas whipped round, offended in the extreme. Aragorn gave the smirking man an unimpressed look for encouraging them and spoke loudly over Legolas in the hopes of quelling the argument before it could gain traction. How far is it to Edoras? It would benefit us to resupply and gather any new knowledge of the enemy from the Rohirrim. I'd say 2 more days at the current speed of travel, said Sai, flicking through his sketchpad to find an unused page to draw the forest from this distance. We should pass Helm's Deep along the way, noted Aragorn as he unfurled the map to their current location. You'd like it, Gimli. The Deeping Wall has saved the lives of the people on many occasions. A fortress? Asked Sakura. Yes, built into the mountainside. They say its walls are unimpeachable, he replied. Useful, remarked Naruto from his position lying with his eyes closed against the sun. Do you have such buildings? Asked Boromir, having recovered from his amusement at the interplay between elf and dwarf. Well, some places do, I suppose. Konoha has a wall that runs around it, but it can hardly be said to be a fortress wall, said Sakura. You could call the Hokage's tower a fortress, mused Sai, the landscape taking shape under his hand as he half listened to the conversation around him. Only when Tsunade-bachan is in it, said Naruto. Naruto! Chided Sakura, though she knew Naruto was grinning under his mask. You all use titles after people's names to show respect, right? What does that mean? Asked Pippin, always keen for learning something that seemed to make people smile. Sakura huffed. It means old lady. Such things are very offensive to the more mature amongst us, said Gandalf, giving Pippin a pointed look when he shared a gleeful glance with Merry. The road they continued along was well traveled, both on foot and by transport such as horses and carts. For the Fellowship, who had been traversing over rough terrain for the previous weeks, it was something of a joy to walk along an even track. Aragorn assured the ninjas and hobbits that before the shadow had started to spread from Isengard this road had been a busy thoroughfare. However, with the threat of roving orc patrols, or perhaps worse in the form of the Black Riders, they passed no other living creatures on their way. Occasionally in the distance they saw evidence of settlements in small clustered buildings with the smoke from fires rising lazily into the sky. However, it was clear that the people of Rohan were no longer straying far from the meager protection of their homes. Later that day they came to a simple wooden sign that marked a fork in the road. If they continued straight they would come to Edoras. If they turned off to the right then they would come to Helm's Deep. The distance was too great to see the great fortress as the hills of the plains hid the base of the mountains from view, but they discussed the notion of returning this way to view it more closely. Gimli would always be interested in the workings of stone, even if it were not by dwarves, though it was clear that Legolas was less than keen. The next day, after they had camped some distance from the road with the intention of avoiding potential threats traveling along it, Legolas held up a hand to motion for the fellowship to stop. "What do you see, Legolas?" asked Aragorn, resting his hand once more on the pommel of his sword. "Riders approach, a small party," replied Legolas, his elf eyes narrowed as he attempted to identify them. "Foes?" asked Gandalf. "Nay, Rohirrim," stated Legolas, his certainty allowing the fellowship to ease themselves from their battle-ready stances. Legolas' keen vision was proven correct as soon the riders of the Riddermark drew up to them. The leader of dozen men advanced, his face hidden behind a helmet with a long plume flowing from the center. "A strange company enters our lands indeed," he said, casting his eye over the gathered group of races. "State your identity, and your business within Rohan." Boromir stepped forward. "It is the Captain General of Gondor, Boromir, son of Denethor the Steward of Gondor, and these are my traveling companions." The leader nodded, evidently recognizing Boromir, and swung down from his horse to clasp hands firmly with the Gondorian. "Indeed, I recognize the steward's son. Too long has it been since our peoples have had contact." "Indeed, my friend, your name?" asked Boromir. "Halath, my lord." "Named after the son of Helm Hammerhand?" asked Gandalf, moving forward also. "Aye, Gandalf Stormcrow, it has been many years since we have had your counsel," Halath replied. "A fault of my own, I assure you. We come to Edoras as part of a long journey," said Gandalf, implicitly asking for permission to continue on to the great hold of the Eorlingas. "You come at a dark time. Our Lord Theoden lays deathly ill and the poison spread by the Wormtongue still lingers in his hall," said Halath, almost spitting the name of the king's advisor. "The Dunlendings attack our farms and word of orcs burning the countryside have reached us." "What of Theodred? Or his cousin Eomer? What news of my old friends?" asked Boromir. "His Highness Lord Theodred has taken his father's seat to call our response to the dangers we face. He is in Edoras now. Our Lord Eomer and his riders have yet to return from a sighting of orcs the like of which we have never seen before," replied Halath. Sakura, Sai and Naruto shared a significant look. They would have to reveal their suspicions on the nature of these new orcs to Gandalf as soon as they could without panicking. "The hobbits. May we proceed?" "Perhaps Gandalf may be of assistance to Theoden," pressed Boromir. Halath again looked over the company Boromir kept. "I trust you, my lord, but we must be wary of spies of the Dark Lord, and of Saruman." Gandalf smiled. "I commend your caution, but we can be trusted, as I am sure you will agree once you know of our purpose. In truth, you need not worry of Saruman. He can no longer pose a threat to your lands." Halath wavered. "What do you mean, Gandalf?" "All will be explained once we reach Edoras. The road is not safe for travelers such as ourselves. I have never done your country wrong, and neither has Boromir, nor Aragorn the Ranger." "We must continue to your lord's hall," said the wizard, smiling kindly at the man. Halath turned to his fellow riders and walked to them to conference on the matter of whether they should allow the strangers that accompanied the trusted personage of Gandalf and Boromir into the heart of their lands. The presence of the ninjas in their strange masks made them uneasy, far more so than the childlike hobbits. Several of the men expressed wonder at the presence of a real elf and a real dwarf, races they had never expected to meet. Finally they agreed on a course of action. "We will escort you to Edoras, and take you to our Lord Theodred. It would be unwise to forego your knowledge, Gandalf, especially when Theoden may need your aid. I must warn you, Lord Boromir, that the actions of your companions will be held to you if you are willing to vouch for them," stated Halath. "I trust my companions and I gladly offer my word as proof of their worthiness," answered Boromir, putting a fist to his chest and bowing to formalize the oath. Halath nodded. "Indeed, then come. Edoras is not much further." He mounted his horse with such ease and practiced grace that even the ninjas were impressed by his bearing. He motioned for his riders to circle the fellowship and they set an easy pace, mindful of the shorter members of the fellowship. Soon a hill rising from the plain came into view and several gasps were heard from the fellowship as they gazed on the city of Edoras, shining brightly in the weak sunlight. What if Naruto was sent to Lord of the Rings? And thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel, and leave a like if you guys need the next part. Comment down and thanks for watching the video, and see you guys in the next video.